I only needed shelter. But that old toboggan seemed to be waiting for me.
She was 25 and exhausted. No home, no winter coat worth naming, no person expecting her. Just a canvas backpack and $3 she had saved from returning bottles behind a closed grocery in Watertown. And with that $3, she bought a snowshoe-maker's cabin and toboggan shed, half buried near Tahawus in Essex County, New York, a mining place that fell off most maps after 1963. The north wall leaned 4 inches out of plumb. The chimney had split where frost entered the mortar. The county said the building had been closed since 1989 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the hollowed heart of a hand-built maple toboggan, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 60 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Iris Mercer had been leaving her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she had practiced it in modest ways, though nobody called it leaving then. She learned how to fold a blanket so it would take less space at the foot of a bed. She learned which floorboards complained in the hall outside her mother's room, and how to pass over them with the care of a deer crossing crusted snow. She learned to keep her school papers in one stack, her mittens inside her boots, her library card in the same pocket of the same blue skirt, because a thing found quickly could be gathered quickly, and a thing gathered quickly could be carried away. They lived then in a narrow house outside Lowville where the wind came down from Tug Hill with snow in its mouth, and stayed against the windows until April. The house had belonged to her mother's aunt before it belonged to anyone else, and the rooms held that kind of patient poverty that does not ask for sympathy. The kitchen table had one leg shorter than the others, corrected by a folded seed catalogue. The stair rail had been rubbed smooth by hands that rose before daylight and came home smelling of wool, wood smoke and cold iron. Iris was a careful child, not timid exactly, though some teachers used that word when they meant a girl who did not hurry to fill the air. She could sit beside a radiator and read the same page twice because she liked the way a sentence settled after the first reading. She could listen to grown people talk around a subject until the hidden shape of it appeared. Her lunch was often bread with butter and sugar, folded in wax paper. She ate it slowly, she made it last. Her mother Elena worked the morning shift at the county nursing home where the halls smelled of bleach, lemon polish and boiled coffee. She left before the light came up, and when she returned, her hands had the reddish shine of a woman who washed them too often in hot water. Elena was slight, brown-haired, and beautiful in the unadorned way of people who do not have time to consider beauty. She kept a jar of buttons on the sill above the sink, a jar of dimes in the flower cupboard, and a silence around her past so complete that Iris sometimes imagined it had been sewn shut before she was born. Of Iris's father there was only a photograph, trimmed too close at the edges, showing a young man in a dark work shirt standing beside a stack of ash poles. He had broad hands and a sideways patience in his face. His name was Nathan Mercer, though Elena rarely said it aloud. He had died when Iris was 3. Not all at once, but over 12 winter days after his truck went through black ice near Old Forge, and came to rest among tamaracks so cold they held the shape of the night. Iris remembered nothing of him that could be trusted, only the smell of wool and leather when she pressed her face to the coat her mother would not throw away. The man who gave Iris her true inheritance was not her father, though he carried the same last name and the same long-knuckled hands. He was her grandfather's younger brother, Elias Mercer, and he lived 40 miles north in a weathered camp at the edge of a cedar swamp, where the road narrowed to 2 ruts, and the mailbox leaned like it had been listening for news too long. Elias was not a large man. He had shoulders curved by bench work, a beard white enough to catch sawdust, and eyes the pale grey of frozen creek water. On winter Saturdays, when Elena could borrow a neighbour's car or trade a shift for gasoline money, she brought Iris to him before breakfast and left her there until near dark. Those Saturdays became the only calendar Iris trusted. The camp had 3 rooms and a shed full of bentwood forms. The air inside carried spruce gum, stove ash, rawhide, and the sweet green breath of steamed ash. Elias made snowshoes the way some men say prayers, without display and without impatience. He cut black ash by the growth ring, split it with wedges, shaved the strips thin, and soaked them before bending them around wooden forms darkened by years of use. He taught Iris how to watch grain, how to hear a flaw before she could see it, how to lace rawhide across the frame in a pattern that made emptiness strong enough to carry weight. "Never hurry what has to hold you," he told her once. And he said it while pressing a steamed ash strip around the toe of a bare paw snowshoe, his thumbs steady, the wood resisting and then yielding by degrees. Iris did not answer because she knew even at 9 that some sentences ought to be kept whole. He did not mean only wood. He meant bread rising under a towel, grief moving through a house, a child learning to trust her own hands. He meant a life that would break if bent too quickly, and one that might hold if warmed, shaped, and allowed to dry in its own time. Their weekend ritual never changed much, and because it never changed, it became a kind of shelter. Elias would set oatmeal on the stove in a dented pot with maple sugar shaved thin over the top. Iris would wash the bowls in water drawn from the hand pump and dried with a towel that had once been white. Then they would go into the shed. In summer, deer flies struck the window screens and light fell green through the hemlocks. In winter, snow sealed the world until the camp seemed afloat in silence. He let her sweep shavings first. Then he let her sort rawhide by width, soaking the stiff lengths in a basin, until they softened enough to pull. Later he let her drill holes with a hand brace, the bit turning with a low wooden complaint. By 12 she could set the tow cord. By 14 she could lace a tail neatly enough that Elias took it apart only once instead of 3 times. He never praised in the usual way. He would hold the work up, turn it toward the window and say, "That will not shame you from him. That was a blessing." There were toboggans too, long ones with curled noses and crosspieces pegged true, the kind made for hauling firewood, flour sacks, and sometimes a hurt neighbour down from a ridge when no wagon could pass. Elias showed her how maple behaved differently from ash, how steam did not force wood but invited it, how a rawhide repair could outlast a metal one if kept dry and rubbed with tallow before the cold set in. He had maps tacked above the bench, not printed maps but hand-drawn winter routes in brown ink, marked with creek crossings, abandoned logging grades, and places where snow drifted deep enough to bury a fence. He touched those maps with one finger as if they were living memory. "Roads are for summer people," he once said. "Winter keeps its own paths." That was Elias's one unforgettable saying, the one that stayed under Iris's ribs long after his voice was gone. It meant that what looked closed from one season might open in another, but only for those who had learned the land carefully enough to see it. It meant trouble had roots through it. It meant a person could move when others believed she could not. He died the January Iris turned 16, sitting upright in the chair beside his stove, with a half-mended Ojibwe-style frame across his lap and a kettle gone dry on the iron. A neighbour found him 2 days later after noticing no smoke from the pipe. The funeral was held in a church basement because the sanctuary furnace had failed, and everyone wore coats while the pastor read from a Bible whose pages trembled in his hands. Afterward, the camp was handled by people who did not understand it. A cousin from Syracuse took the hand tools, saying they might be worth something. A man with a trailer hauled away the bending forms for barn decoration. The maps disappeared with a tin document box that Elena searched for and never found. Iris stood in the packed snow beside the shed while adults made decisions around her, and she kept one narrow scrap of rawhide from the floor because it was the only thing nobody wanted. By spring, the camp had been sold for taxes. By summer, a new owner had painted the door red and hung a plastic bear beside it. Iris saw a photograph of it years later on a rental listing, called Rustic Adirondack Escape, and closed the browser without touching the keys for a long while. The loss did not come as thunder. It came as subtraction. First the Saturdays were gone, then the smell of steam and ash, then the shape of Elias's hands guiding hers, then the certainty that somewhere, even if her own house felt thin and changeable, there was a bench with her place beside it. When Iris was 19, her mother married Warren Pike, a man who sold used snowmobiles in season and boat trailers when the thaw came. Warren was not cruel in any dramatic fashion. He did not pound tables or shout in public. He wore cologne over cigarette smoke and kept his keys on a heavy ring that struck his thigh as he walked. He had a way of standing in doorways that made a room feel borrowed from him. He called himself practical. He said memory was a luxury poor people could not afford. He boxed Nathan's coat and put it in the attic. He took down the photograph of Iris's father because, as he said, a house should make room for the living. Elena did not argue. She had begun by then to move through her days as if listening to weather nobody else could hear. Warren had a daughter from his first marriage, Marla, older than Iris by 5 years, and already practiced in the sharp arithmetic of wanting. Marla came in and out of the house with lacquered nails, perfume and shopping bags. She hid in the trunk of her car. She called Elena Mama E when she needed money and your mother when bills came. She was bright in the way of broken glass near a window, catching attention, even when no one wished to look. At first, Iris tried to be careful around her. She washed Marla's coffee cups without being asked. She moved her shoes from the back entry so Marla would not complain about clutter. She listened when Marla described jobs she had nearly gotten, apartments she had nearly rented, men who had nearly behaved properly. But there was no amount of carefulness that could make Marla kind. Kindness, Iris learned, was not always waiting behind someone's trouble. Sometimes trouble was only trouble, and it used kindness for kindling. The house began to change under Warren and Marla's hands. The button jar vanished. The dimes in the flower cupboard were spent. Elena's aunt's silver thimble, Nathan's watch, the quilt made from Mercer work shirts, all of them disappeared one by one, each absence explained after the fact, and never quite directly. Warren said taxes, Marla said emergencies. Elena sat at the kitchen table with a shawl around her shoulders, nodding as if agreement might keep peace from leaving entirely. Iris worked wherever she could, dishwasher at a diner, night clerk at a motel near Carthage, seasonal cleaner at cabins along Fourth Lake where wealthy families arrived with insulated boots and left behind half-used jars of preserves. She saved in envelopes marked with pencil, dental, truck, rent. Winter, but the envelopes thinned whenever the house needed oil, whenever Marla cried, whenever Warren had a plan that required just a little bridge money. Iris gave because Elena looked at her with tired eyes, and because daughters often mistake surrender for devotion when a mother is fading in front of them. Elena died in late October, after the maples had dropped most of their leaves and before the first serious snow. She died in a hospital room in Watertown, with a TV murmuring at the ceiling and a paper cup of ice chips melting untouched on the tray. Iris was holding her hand when the breath changed. Marla was in the parking lot on the phone. Warren had gone to get coffee and came back smelling faintly of gasoline. The funeral was small. The bill was not. 3 days afterward, Warren told Iris the house had complications. That was the word he used. Complications. He laid papers on the kitchen table where Elena had once rolled pie dough, and his finger tapped signatures Iris recognized but did not understand. A home equity loan, a second lien, a note against the property. Marla stood behind him in a camel-coloured coat, looking not at Iris, but at the window above the sink. The eviction came on November 17th, in the first hard snow of the season. Iris had been in the attic, looking for Nathan's coat, when she heard the front door open and close twice below. By the time she came down, her backpack sat on the porch, already dusted white. Her work shoes had been set beside it, so had a cardboard box containing 3 sweaters, a hairbrush, Elias's scrap of rawhide wrapped in wax paper, and a framed photograph of Elena turned face down against the wet boards. Warren held the doorknob from inside, as if the house itself had asked him to guard it. Marla stood at the foot of the stairs with a brass key in her hand, the key Iris had used since she was tall enough to reach the lock. She signed it all away before she died. 8 words. No raised voice. No apology. The sentence passed through the cold air and entered Iris with the exactness of a needle. Warren did not look at her. Marla's mouth trembled, though not from sorrow. On the table behind them lay Elena's blue fountain pen, uncapped, as if her mother had only stepped into the next room and might return to explain why her name had gone onto papers that emptied the house of her daughter. Iris picked up the photograph. Snow had melted along the frame and darkened the cardboard backing. She wiped it with her sleeve, but the damp had already reached Elena's face beneath the glass, turning the image cloudy at the edges. That was the silent betrayal she carried away. Not proof that her mother had meant harm, but proof that silence can sign what the hand does not understand. She did not plead. She did not pound the door after Warren shut it. She stood long enough to hear the deadbolt turn, then lifted the backpack and box and walked down the road while snow gathered in her hair. For 6 weeks, Iris lived by inches. The first night she slept in the women's restroom of a bus station in Watertown, sitting upright on the closed toilet with her feet on her backpack so nobody could take it. The fluorescent light flickered above her until dawn. She had $37 then, 2 granola bars, and a paper cup of coffee bought mostly for the heat of it. By the 3rd day she was in Syracuse, because the bus south had been cheaper than staying still. She spent a night in the basement fellowship hall of a Methodist church that opened during cold weather, where cots stood in 2 rows, and everyone learned not to ask about anyone else's shoes. A woman with orange mittens gave her a pair of wool socks with a hole at the heel. Iris turned the socks inside out and wore them anyway. She tried the shelters, the warming rooms, the job boards taped to glass doors. She washed in library sinks. She ate peanut butter from single-serving packets taken with permission from a church pantry. When her money dropped to $19.12, she stopped buying coffee. When it dropped to $11.40, she stopped using buses, except when the cold made her hands clumsy enough to frighten her. Albany came next, not by plan, but by the logic of one open seat and a driver who did not ask for the extra dollar when she came up short. In Albany, she slept 2 nights in a hallway outside a locked office suite after finding the stairwell door that did not latch. The floor smelled of salt rubber mats and copier toner. She woke before the first employees arrived and left no sign except a single strand of hair caught on her scarf. She learned which public libraries allowed a person to sit longest without being moved along. She learned the warmest chair in the main branch was near the local history shelves, beside a radiator that clicked every 20 minutes. She learned that shame was loudest when a person still had strength to argue with it, and quieter when hunger took over. She did not become hard. Hardness would have required more food. In Glens Falls, she found day-work cleaning rooms at a roadside motel whose manager paid cash and watched the clock as if every minute belonged personally to him. She worked 4 days, stripped beds, scrubbed tubs, carried bags of towels through a back hall where the dryer vent made the air briefly kind. She earned enough to buy a thrift store sweater, 2 cans of soup, and a pair of men's gloves with the fingertips nearly worn through. The mountains drew nearer, without her intending them to. North Creek, Warrensburg, Chestertown. Names from maps Elias had once touched with his finger. She avoided thinking of that connection because thinking required room, and room was exactly what she did not have. By the last week of December, Iris had $5.82. She was sleeping in a hay barn outside Warrensburg after asking the farmer's wife if she might stay 1 night out of the wind. The woman looked at Iris's face, then at the sky, then said she could sleep near the square bales but not smoke and not light anything. Iris thanked her and meant it more than the woman could have known. Hay dust settled in her throat. Mice moved inside the walls. The cold entered slowly, like someone reading a long letter with bad news. On the morning, she found the advertisement. She had walked 6 miles into town because the library opened at 10 and libraries still belonged. A little to anyone who could be quiet. It was a brick building with green trim and a bulletin board crowded by babysitting notices, church suppers, firewood offers, and a flyer for a lost tabby cat, whose photograph had faded pink from the sun. Iris stood before the board, mostly to give her legs a reason to stop trembling. Her gloves were wet. Her hair had come loose from its braid. She was trying to decide whether to spend $1 on a day-old roll from the bakery or keep all her coins untouched until evening. The classified notice had been typed on county letterhead. then copied until the words had softened at the edges. Essex County surplus, structure sale, former wintercraft cabin and sled shed, Tahawus vicinity, town of Newcomb. Unsafe, no utilities, no warranty. Buyer responsible for removal, repair, or demolition. Minimum bid, $3. Deed transfer by appointment only. Someone had circled minimum bid in blue ink, maybe as a joke. Beneath the notice, 3 tear-off tabs remained, each with a phone number and the words ASIS printed in capital letters. Iris read it once. Then she read it again, more slowly. Former wintercraft cabin. Sled shed. Tahawus vicinity. $3. There are moments in a life when a thing does not call loudly. It does not blaze or open or promise. It merely waits in the corner of the room with a patience that resembles endurance. Iris took one of the tabs and folded it into the pocket where she kept Elias's scrap of rawhide. At the librarian's desk, she asked to use the phone. Her voice came out rough from cold and disuse. The librarian, a man with silver hair and a cardigan missing one button, slid the phone toward her without comment and turned away with the courtesy of pretending not to listen. The county office answered on the 4th ring. A woman with a dry, efficient voice told Iris there had been no bids. No one wanted the structure. The road was not maintained in winter beyond a certain point. The building was dangerous. The buyer would assume all responsibility. The appointment calendar was nearly empty after the holidays. If she had certified funds or cash, she could come in the next morning. "I have cash," Iris said. There was a pause on the line, not unkind, only surprised. $3? Yes, ma'am. The woman sighed through her nose, papers shifting near the receiver. Then be here at 9. Iris hung up and stood with her hand still on the phone. Outside, traffic hissed through slush. A child in a red hat pressed both palms against the library window and looked in at her as if she were part of the weather. She did not believe she had been rescued. Rescue was too large a word and too often used by people who wished to be admired for opening a door. She believed only that a path, narrow as a rawhide lace, had appeared under the snow, and that she still had enough strength to place one foot on it. That afternoon she spent $1.69 on a loaf of day-old bread, because a journey made on pride alone would fail before dark. She bought no coffee. She returned to the hay barn before the sky went blue, ate 2 slices of bread with snow melted in her mouth, and repacked her belongings with the exact care of someone preparing for an inspection. Into the backpack went the sweaters, the photograph of Elena wrapped in a shirt, the hairbrush, the wax paper packet of rawhide, a library pencil, and the notice from the bulletin board. Into the cardboard box went nothing. She left it near the barn door because she could not carry both, and because the box had belonged to the house that had let her go. Before sleeping, she counted her remaining money on the flat top of a bale. $4.13. 3 would purchase a condemned cabin. $1.13 would have to carry her toward it. She lay down in her coat, pulled hay over her boots, and listened to the barn settle around her. The roof creaked. A horse shifted in a stall below. Far off, a truck moved along the county road, its tires making a patient sound through snowmelt and gravel. By morning, she would begin walking toward the clerk's office with the deed fee in her pocket and no clear plan beyond reaching the next door before it closed. By 6:30, the road out of Warrensburg had turned the colour of tin, and Iris was following the shoulder north with her backpack pulled high between her shoulder blades. A school bus passed once, empty except for the driver, its yellow sides dulled by road salt. The wind it made pushed a powder of snow against her legs and left her standing still for 3 breaths, one hand on the strap, one hand inside her coat where the folded notice had gone soft from being touched. The sky was not yet light. It had only loosened from black to pewter, with a narrow seam of lavender over the eastern ridge. She had been told at the library that the county office in Elizabethtown was too far to walk in one morning, and that statement was true in the ordinary sense. But the ordinary sense belonged to people with fares, cars, couches, names they could call. Iris had one ride promised as far as Pottersville by the farmer's wife, who drove a dented green pickup and said almost nothing after pointing to the passenger seat. The heater in the truck worked only on high, and it smelled of dog hair, old feed, and the sharp sweetness of pine air freshener clipped to the vent. At Pottersville, the woman let her out beside a gas station not yet open and pressed 2 hard-boiled eggs into her hand. Wrapped in a napkin. "Road's mean today," she said. "Yes." Ma'am. "That office closes for lunch." "Yes, ma'am." The woman looked at the backpack, then at Iris's shoes. "You got any people up there?" Iris closed her fingers around the eggs until the shells warmed against her palm. "No, ma'am." The woman nodded once, as if that was not an answer to be corrected, and drove away through a low grey plume of exhaust. From there Iris walked and took what came. A mail carrier carried her 6 miles talking about ice fishing and the price of propane. A man with a plumbing van took her another 12 after she helped him push the back doors closed against a coil of frozen hose. She rode the last leg in silence beside a retired teacher named Miss Anson, whose car smelled of peppermint lozenges and whose back seat held 3 boxes of donated children's books. The day never warmed past 12 degrees. Miss Anson said so when they passed the bank sign outside Shroon Lake, its red numbers blinking through frost. 12, then 11, then 12 again, as if the machine could not decide whether mercy should be measured upward or down. Iris spent that night before the appointment, not in a room but in a hay barn 5 miles south of Elizabethtown, after darkness and distance proved stronger than intention. A dairy farmer found her standing near the end of his lane, studying the black square of his barn with the helpless care of someone who did not want to trespass and could not keep walking. He was a compact man in a knit cap, carrying 2 pails that knocked against his knees. "You lost?" "No, sir." He looked toward the road, where blown snow made the ditch indistinct. "That is worse sometimes." She did not answer. He let her sleep in the upper loft, away from the animals, where hay had been stacked in golden tiers and cold sifted through the boards in threads. It was 9 degrees by the thermometer nailed to a post below. He told her that before he left her there, not as complaint but as instruction. 9 degrees meant no skin uncovered long. 9 degrees meant boots kept on. 9 degrees meant a person did not trust sleep too much. The hay held the day's faint warmth near its heart. Iris made a hollow among the bales and tucked her backpack beneath her head. Below her, cows shifted in their stalls, chains rasping softly, their bodies making a deep domestic heat that rose in breaths through the planked floor. She ate 1 egg in the dark and saved the other. The shell broke badly under her thumb, and she picked the pieces away one by one because there was nothing in her life just then that could be wasted carelessly. Before dawn, the farmer's wife brought coffee in a jar wrapped with a towel. She did not come up the ladder. She set it on the 3rd rung and called, "Careful down." Iris drank it standing beside the barn door while the eastern sky gathered itself behind black maples. She could see the road now, pale between snowbanks, and beyond it the first lifting shoulders of the Adirondacks. Not dramatic at that hour. Only present. She reached Elizabethtown a little after 8. It was a county seat in winter, which meant it looked both official and half asleep. Salt had whitened the curbs. Icicles hung from gutters in uneven teeth. The flag in front of the courthouse moved stiffly, not waving so much as resisting. Iris passed a Stewart's shop with 2 pickup trucks idling outside, their drivers drinking coffee under fluorescent light. She passed Deer's Head Inn, its windows glowing amber above a porch swept almost clean. Farther along stood a pharmacy with a green cross painted in the window, a hardware store whose front display held snow shovels, stovepipe, and a red plastic sled, and a small diner called Maple Finch Cafe, where someone had written "Soup Today" on a chalkboard propped by the door. There was also a barber pole, unmoving in the cold, and a real estate office with photographs of lake houses taped neatly behind glass. Iris slowed before those photographs without meaning to. Each house had lights on in every room, a porch cleared, a name printed beneath it. Waterfront, upt aid, turnkey. She stood there long enough for her breath to fog the glass, then continued toward the county building, because she had an appointment with the opposite of turnkey. The clerk's office occupied the first floor of a brick municipal building that had taken winter into its stones. Inside, the hallway smelled of floor wax, paper, and wet wool. A bulletin board held meeting notices, dog license reminders, and a faded map of Essex County with the towns outlined in pale colours. Somewhere deeper in the building, a copier made a steady, warming hum. Iris wiped her shoes on the mat until no more slush came off, then did it once more because the mat was there, and because she had entered enough public places lately to know how quickly a person could be judged by the water left behind. Her hands shook as she removed her gloves. The air inside felt almost hot against her cracked knuckles. The clerk's counter had a brass rail along the top and a glass partition with a half-moon opening for documents. Behind it sat 3 desks, 2 empty and 1 occupied by a woman in a charcoal cardigan, her hair the colour of iron filings pinned at the back of her head. A nameplate stood on the desk, black letters on brushed metal. MRS. Adeline P. Washburn. County Clerk. She looked up over reading glasses attached to a fine gold chain. She was perhaps 65, narrow-faced, with careful lipstick and hands that moved across papers as if the papers deserved accuracy whether or not the people did. There was a china mug beside her, a stack of deed folders, a brass stamp, and a small dish of paper clips sorted by size. "You are Miss Mercer?" Iris stepped closer to the opening in the glass. "Yes." "Ma'am." "Mrs." Washburn looked at the clock, then back at Iris. "You are early." "Yes, ma'am." That seemed to satisfy her more than an explanation would have. She lifted a folder from the stack and opened it with 2 fingers. The pages inside had been tagged with yellow slips. Iris saw a property number, the words "surplus structure," and a black and white photograph of a building nearly swallowed by snow. "Mrs." Washburn read for a moment in silence. Then she took off her glasses and folded her hands on the folder. "You understand this is not a residence?" "Yes." "Ma'am." "You understand there is no certificate of occupancy?" "Yes." "Ma'am." "There is no electrical service?" "Yes." "Ma'am." "No running water?" "No septic permit?" "No maintained winter access beyond the posted road?" "Yes." "Ma'am." "You understand the roof may fail?" "Yes." "Ma'am." "And if the structure harms you, or if you are required to remove it, the county will not be responsible?" Iris looked at the file photograph. The building was plain and weathered. Phone story and a loft under a steep roof with a lower shed attached to one side. Snow had climbed nearly to the sill line. A hand-painted sign above the larger door had lost most of its letters. "Yes." "Ma'am." "Mrs." Washburn watched her for a moment longer. Her expression did not soften, but it changed by a fraction, as snow changes when the first sun reaches it and nothing has melted yet. "You also understand that several people asked about this property over the years and declined after seeing it?" "Yes." "Ma'am." "Contractors included?" "Yes." "Ma'am." "Men with trucks?" Iris held her gloves in both hands. "Yes." "Ma'am." The clerk put her glasses back on. "Very well." The signing took longer than the paying. Mrs. Washburn slid the papers through the opening one at a time and placed a blue X wherever Iris was to sign. The pen was chained to the counter, heavy and cold. Iris wrote her name carefully, not because anyone had asked her to, but because the letters looked like the only proof that she had passed through the morning and remained herself. The bills she laid on the counter had been folded twice and kept flat between pages torn from a motel notepad. Mrs. Washburn counted them without comment. Then she opened a receipt book, wrote slowly in duplicate, and tore the top copy free with a soft rasp. The brass stamp came last. Mrs. Washburn stood, aligned the deed beneath it, and pressed down with both hands. The sound entered the room like a small door closing in law. "There," she said. She slid the deed copy toward Iris, then an envelope containing a survey sheet, a tax map printout, and a set of directions written in her own hand. "You will take Route 9N south to Route 73, then west toward Keene, though you will not go through Keene if you have sense today. From Newcomb Road, follow the posted plough line until the county maintenance ends. After that, you are walking. There is an old logging lane off the right side, marked by 2 walnut trees and a rusted culvert. The lane does not look like a lane in winter. If you reach the collapsed ore loader foundation, you have gone too far." Iris took the envelope. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Washburn did not let go immediately. "Do you have a vehicle?" "No." "Ma'am." "A sled?" "No." "Ma'am." "Snowshoes?" "No." "Ma'am." The clerk's fingers remained on the envelope for 1 exact second longer, then released it. "Then you will walk slowly. Deliberately. Not bravely." Iris nodded. "That is different, Mrs. Washburn added. "Yes." "Ma'am." The clerk wrote something on a square of yellow paper and tucked it behind the map. "There is a man on Goodnow Flow Road named Pritchard who ploughs for the county sometimes. He is not friendly, but he is not cruel. If you come upon his place before dark, you may ask where the lane begins. Do not ask him for a ride unless he offers." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Washburn closed the folder, but instead of placing it aside, she turned back to the first page. Her eyes moved to the name Iris had signed. She traced nothing with her finger, yet the attention in her face sharpened. "Mercer," she said. Iris stood still. "Yes, ma'am." The clerk's gaze rose to her. There were Mercers in that part of the mountains. Iris's hands tightened around the envelope. "I have heard that. Not many left now." Mrs. Washburn opened a lower drawer, took out a ledger older than the folders on her desk, and laid it carefully beside the current file. The cover was green cloth worn grey at the corners. She turned several pages, each ruled by hand and filled with ink that had browned at the strokes. "This is not required for the sale. It is only a habit of mine." Iris did not speak. Mrs. Washburn stopped at a page dated decades earlier. Here, snow equipment maker, seasonal guide, emergency route contractor, Mercer, E. She paused over the initial. There was a man by that name who filed winter easements and rescue path notices for cabins that no longer exist. Some of those notices touched the parcel you have just bought. The room seemed to narrow around the counter. The copier stopped humming. Somewhere outside, a truck backed up, its warning beep faint through the glass. Mrs. Washburn looked again at Iris's face, but she did not ask the question waiting there. It was a mercy, that omission. "Did you know him?" she said instead. Iris lowered her eyes to the deed. "Yes, ma'am." The clerk closed the ledger slowly. I wondered. She returned it to the drawer and kept one hand resting on the handle. "When I was a girl, my father kept a pair of his snowshoes in our mudroom. Wide as a table. Ugly as sin. Best things ever made. He used to say those shoes could carry a sinner over judgment." Iris almost smiled, but not enough for the expression to become public. "He would not have liked that said too loudly," she answered. "No, Mrs. Washburn said, and there was something almost warm in the single syllable. "I imagine not." She reached into her own purse, removed a dollar bill folded into quarters, and placed it on top of the receipt book. For a moment Iris did not understand. "The copy fee, Mrs." Washburn said. "I did not pay a copy fee. No. I waived it." She tapped the dollar once, then put it into the desk drawer among pens and rubber bands. "So the county books will not complain. Some offices require a small private arrangement with common sense." Iris looked at the drawer closing over the bill. "Thank you." The words were plain, but the clerk accepted them as if they were complete. "Do not waste daylight, Mrs." Washburn said. Outside, the cold took Iris by the face. She stood on the courthouse steps and tucked the deed inside her shirt beneath 2 layers of wool, where body heat might keep the paper from stiffening. The envelope went into the backpack between the photograph and the rawhide scrap. She ate the second hard-boiled egg while standing near a stone planter filled with brown stalks of ornamental grass. Salt stung the cracks at the corners of her mouth. By 10. She had left the village behind. The road west carried the sound of tires differently than town streets. It gave each passing vehicle a long approach, a brief violence, then a fading hiss. Iris kept to the shoulder where the plough had thrown snow into a ridge dirty with sand. When the shoulder vanished, she stepped into the ditch and waited. The sky remained low. The mountains ahead were not a wall, but a series of darker silences behind one another. A woman in a Subaru stopped near noon and drove her several miles without conversation except to ask whether Iris needed the hospital. Iris said no. The woman did not believe her entirely, but she let the answer stand. A delivery driver let her ride on a sack of mail tubs in the back of a van that smelled of cardboard and diesel. After that, no one stopped for a long while. She passed houses set far back from the road, their roofs white and their windows bright with lives proceeding indoors. Smoke rose from chimneys in separate honest columns. At one place a black dog came down the drive barking with the confidence of ownership, then stopped at the buried ditch and watched her pass with snow on his muzzle. She told him, "I know," though she was not certain what she meant. Near Goodnow Flow Road, the ploughed surface narrowed. The county had done its duty and no more. Snowbanks stood high enough to hide stone walls. Spruce limbs bent under weight. The air smelled different there. Less of road and more of balsam, iron, and water under ice. She found Pritchard's place by the sound first, a plough blade scraping gravel behind a barn. The house was square and severe, with green shutters and a porch cleared down to bare boards. A rusted tractor sat beside a woodpile taller than Iris. The man himself emerged from behind the barn wearing a canvas coat, so patched it seemed made from several coats that had agreed to continue together. He did not come closer. "You lost?" "No, sir." He waited, shovel in hand. "I bought the county structure near the old lane," she said. "Mrs. Washburn said you might know where it begins." "At the clerk's name." His eyebrows moved. "Bought it?" "Yes, sir." "With money?" "Yes, sir." He leaned on the shovel and looked at her boots. "Not enough money." "By the look." Iris said nothing. He turned and pointed with the shovel handle toward the road beyond his drive. Half-mile past the culvert that sticks out like a broken tooth. 2 walnuts on the right. One split by lightning. Lane runs behind them. Do not step left of the first bend. There is a washout under the snow. "Yes, sir." "And if the roof comes down, it will come down patient. You will hear it before it does." She nodded. He looked at her for another moment, then at the sky. "Dark by 5. "Yes, sir." He went back behind the barn and returned with a length of baling twine, a dented tin cup, and 3 matches wrapped in waxed paper. "Not a gift," he said. "No, sir. Call it preventing paperwork." She took them. "Thank you. Do not thank me unless it works." The old logging lane was exactly where he said it would be, and almost impossible to see. The 2 walnut trees stood at the road's edge like sentries who had forgotten their orders. One had indeed been split long ago, healed around the wound in a dark seam that ran from crotch to root. The rusted culvert showed only one orange rim above the snow, and water spoke beneath it in a low, hidden voice. Iris stepped off the ploughed road and sank to her knees. For a moment she could not move. The snow accepted her weight, then gave way, packing around her shins with cold so intimate it felt personal. She pulled one leg free, planted it farther ahead, and sank again. Without snowshoes, every yard had to be purchased. She understood that now with her body. The lane climbed gently into woods. Hardwoods gave way to spruce, then opened again into a stand of young birch whose white trunks held the dim afternoon light. Every branch carried snow. When the wind moved, the branches released it in soft collapses around her. She followed the faint depression where a track had been, using the split walnut behind her and the darker line of trees ahead to keep direction. The first bend came after 10 minutes. She remembered Pritchard's warning and stayed right, though the right side looked harder. On the left, the snow lay unmarked, smooth and inviting. She prodded it with a fallen branch and felt the branch drop through crust into emptiness. A washout, hidden cleanly. She pulled back and continued. A crow called once from somewhere she could not see. Then the woods settled into a silence so complete that her own breathing became an intrusion. She moved more slowly, deliberately, not bravely. There were neighbours of a sort. A red squirrel scolded from the broken top of a spruce. Chickadees moved in a small committee through birch twigs, their bodies no heavier than the snow they displaced. Farther in, she passed the remains of a stone foundation, perhaps a sugar shack or tool hut, its square shape rounded by drifts. A length of stovepipe lay beside it, half buried, black against white. After nearly an hour, the lane widened. At first, Iris saw only the roofline steep and uneven under a load of snow, then the darker rectangle beneath it. The building stood in a modest clearing backed by hemlock and walnut, with a frozen creek somewhere beyond, audible but unseen. It was narrower than she had imagined, and longer, a cabin joined to a sled shed at a slight angle, as if the second structure had been added in another season by a man working without help. The walls were blackened, cedar shakes over timber framing, patched in places with vertical boards gone silver from weather. The main cabin measured perhaps 24 feet by 16, with a loft window tucked under the front gable and a fieldstone chimney at the east end, cracked near the shoulder. The attached shed ran another 18 feet, lower roofed, its double doors hung on long strap hinges red with rust. A sign above them still held 3 readable words beneath lichen and peeling paint. Mercer Winter Works. Iris stopped where the lane entered the clearing. The name did not strike her loudly. It entered the place where hunger, cold, and recognition were already seated together, and found no room for ceremony. Her breath moved in front of her face. Her hands hung at her sides. Snow began again, not falling so much as appearing, flake by flake, from the heavy air. The porch sagged on the left corner. The steps had vanished under a drift hardened by thaw and freeze. One shutter clung by a single hinge. The roof over the shed bowed between rafters, and an icicle as thick as her wrist hung from the gutterless edge. But the door was still there. The iron latch was still there. Someone, decades ago, had nailed a horseshoe above the frame with the open end upward, so luck, if it came, would not spill out. Iris climbed the drift where steps should have been and cleared snow from the latch with her sleeve. The county had not given her a key. There was no lock, only a wooden bar across the inside that had fallen out of its brackets long ago. The door resisted. She put her shoulder to it, careful at first, then harder. Ice cracked along the threshold. A seam of darkness opened. The smell came first. Cold cedar. Mouse dust. Old leather. Iron gone dry. Beneath those was another scent, faint and sweet, like ash wood steamed long ago and remembered by the walls. Iris stood with 1 foot inside and 1 foot out, letting her eyes adjust. The front room was plain. A work table stood under the south window, its surface grey with dust and marked by cuts, burns and half-moons where clamps had bitten the edge. A small cast-iron stove squatted near the chimney, its pipe disconnected and tilted aside. There were shelves along one wall holding jars, broken awls, coils of wire, a tin of square nails, and 3 wooden forms shaped like the ghosts of snowshoes. Against the opposite wall sat a narrow cot frame with no mattress, only rope webbing sagged loose between rails. The floorboards gave under her first step, but did not break. They sounded different from one another, some hollow, some firm, some with a low complaint like an old throat clearing. She learned 3 safe steps before crossing the room, beside the table leg, near the stove stone, along the seam where 2 boards had been replaced by darker pine. The back room lay beyond a half door. It was not really a room but a shed interior, colder than the cabin and higher in shadow. Toboggans leaned against the wall in various states of use and repair. Some had split noses, some had rawhide lashings snapped and hanging. One long maple sled lay across 2 sawhorses under a canvas stiffened by time, its curled front end turned toward the door like an animal sleeping with one eye open. Iris did not touch it. Not yet. She set her backpack on the work table and listened. The building answered in small ways, snow shifting on the roof, a tick from the stovepipe, a faint drip somewhere near the back wall, though the temperature should have held all water still. Wind pressed along the north side and found cracks to speak through. The place was not welcoming in the way houses in photographs were welcoming. It had no lamp, no clean bed, no food, no promise that morning would be easier than night. Still, it had walls. That first evening she worked until the light failed. She dragged fallen branches from near the wood line, though most were too wet for burning. She cleared the stove enough to see that the firebox had not cracked, but she did not trust the chimney. She used Pritchard's matches only to light a twist of paper long enough to test the draft, and when smoke hesitated at the pipe opening, she pinched the flame out with damp fingers and waited for the sting to pass. No fire. Then she found a broom without a handle and used the bristled end to push mouse leavings from one corner of the room. She shook dust from a canvas drop cloth and spread it on the floor beside the stove, where the stone hearth still held a little separation from the cold below. From her backpack she took the photograph, the rawhide scrap, the deed envelope, and the loaf of bread wrapped in thin plastic. She ate slowly, sitting with her back against the stone, knees drawn under her coat. Dark came early in the clearing. It erased the woods first, then the shed corners, then the shelves, until only the square of the window remained, a dim bruise against the night. The cold inside deepened but did not move as sharply as the cold outside. That mattered. A wall did not have to be warm to be shelter. It only had to stand between a body and the wind. Iris put on both sweaters. She wrapped her feet in the spare shirt. She laid the deed beneath her hip so it would not disappear in the dark, though there was nowhere for it to go. The floor was hard. The canvas smelled of mildew. Something tiny moved inside the wall near her head, and then became still. For a long while she did not sleep. She listened to the old building speak in ticks and sighs. She listened to snow tapping against the window with the patience of a hand that could wait all night. She listened to her own breathing become slower, not because she felt safe exactly, but because fear had used all the strength it had been allotted for that day. Near midnight, the clouds thinned. Moonlight entered through the south window and laid a pale rectangle across the work table. In that light, the wooden snowshoe forms seemed less like abandoned tools than like ribs, waiting for a covering strong enough to bear weight. Iris turned her face toward them and closed her eyes. The house had been waiting. At daylight, Iris found the well by following rabbit tracks. They crossed the clearing from the north side of the cabin, passed beneath a leaning walnut, and ended beside a round stone curb capped with boards and a rusted sheet of tin. Snow had drifted high against it, and at first she mistook the shape for another stump. When she brushed the top clear with both sleeves, the tin rang faintly under her knuckles. Someone had laid 2 flat stones over the boards to keep them from lifting, and both stones had frozen in place. She worked them loose slowly, first with her hands, then with a strip of broken lath from the shed. The boards beneath were silvered but not rotten through. One had split near a nail. She lifted only enough to see darkness below and to smell the cold mineral breath of water. It was not proof the well was safe, not proof the water could be drunk, but the sight of it steadied her more than a fire would have. A place with water had once been meant for staying. The rope was gone. The pulley remained, grooved by long use and stiff with rust. She found an old paint can in the shed, scrubbed it with snow until her hands burned, tied Pritchard's baling twine through the handle, and lowered it carefully. The can struck the stone side twice, then dropped into water with a hollow sound that travelled up the shaft. She pulled it back, hand over hand, the twine cutting into her gloves. The water came up cloudy with disturbed silt. She set it aside for washing and lowered the can again. By the third drawer, it was clear enough to boil, if she could make a fire. The outhouse stood beyond the shed, nearly hidden by hemlocks. It leaned backward as if embarrassed by its own endurance. The moon cutout in the door had been widened by squirrels, and snow had blown across the seat in a clean white fan. Iris cleared what she could with a piece of bark, then stood inside for a moment, looking through cracks in the wall at the pale woods beyond. It was not comfort, it was arrangement. Arrangement mattered. The first 3 days became a slow inventory of what would not kill her immediately. She learned the floor's creaks with the seriousness of a person learning another language. The board by the work table gave a high warning but held. The second plank inside the shed door dipped if stepped on near the left edge, and beneath it she glimpsed black crawl space. The narrow strip beside the stove stone was firm, probably because the joists there had been doubled to carry the weight. Near the back wall, where damp had entered under the sill, the floor made no sound at all, and that silence was worse. She marked the weak places with chips of cedar. She learned that the south window admitted enough light between 9 and noon to work without a lamp, if the snow outside was bright. She learned that the wind came hardest at the north wall after dark and lifted dust from between the boards. She learned to sleep in 2 short pieces, first after sunset, then again before dawn, waking between them to stamp her feet, flex her hands, and listen for any change in the roof. On the second morning she dragged the cot frame closer to the stove, tightened 2 lengths of rope webbing with a broken awl, and covered it with the canvas drop cloth folded 3 times. It was not a bed. It was a raised coldness, but it kept her body off the floor, and that was an advancement plain enough to respect. By the 3rd day, hunger had become organised. It was no longer a sharp visitor, but a clerk at a desk, counting what remained. Bread, 3 slices. Soup, none. Water, enough. Matches, 2. Money, $1.13. Strength, uncertain. She could not repair a chimney with uncertainty. She could not patch a roof with a hope carried loose in her pocket. So she folded the county map into quarters, tucked the deed under the work table drawer, and walked back toward the road before daylight had fully settled over the trees. The mile to the ploughed line took nearly an hour. Her legs sank less now because the path had been broken once, though the night snow had softened it over. When she reached the split walnut, she turned and looked back. From the road, the lane had nearly vanished. If she had not known where to find it, the woods would have closed the secret without effort. The hardware store in Elizabethtown had been one of the 5 businesses she passed on the way to the clerk's office, but she had not entered then. Now she stood before it with cold water in her boots, and the careful shame of someone about to ask for what she could not yet pay for. Haskell hardware, a stove, paint, pipe, rope, glass. The letters were gold on a black sign, weathered but still exact. A row of snow shovels stood in a barrel near the door. Inside, the store smelled of linseed oil, rubber boots, sawdust, kerosene, coffee burned too long, and the fine metallic dust of nails kept in open bins. Narrow aisles ran between shelves that reached higher than Iris could touch. There were stovepipe elbows, lantern wicks, brass hinges, boxes of screws, rolls of tar paper, axe handles, canning jars, enamel basins, bags of mortar mix, and a wall of drawers with porcelain knobs labelled in a careful hand. Behind the counter stood a man with a white moustache so full it seemed to have grown there before the rest of him arrived. He had a wide face, a red nose, and one clouded eye that did not quite follow the other. His wool vest was buttoned wrong by one button. A pencil rested behind his ear. His hands were large and square, with a black half-moon under one thumbnail. He looked at Iris's boots first, then at the wet cuffs of her pants, then at the folded county map in her hand. "You are the one bought Mercer's shed." It was not a question. "Yes, sir. Figured you would come in sooner or later. I need to know what I need first." That is a rarer sentence than it ought to be. He took the pencil from behind his ear and laid it on the counter. "Name is Owen Haskell." "Iris Mercer." "I know." He said it without ceremony. Washburn called. Iris's hands tightened around the map. "Is there a problem?" "There are several, but not with that." He reached beneath the counter and brought up a mug, then thought better of it and set it beside the register. "You eaten?" "Yes, sir." He looked at her in a way that suggested the answer had been examined and found thin. "When?" She did not answer quickly enough. "Mr. Haskell turned toward the back room and called, "May, wrap one of those biscuits before you go." A woman's voice from somewhere unseen said, "Already did." He returned his attention to Iris. "Now, what are you trying not to die from first? Roof, stove, water, or floor?" "The chimney," Iris said. "If I can burn wood safely, I can stay long enough to learn the rest." That answer changed him more than hunger had. He rested both hands on the counter and nodded once. "Chimney first is correct. I have $1.13. That is not correct." "No, sir." "You got identification?" She removed her state ID from the inner pocket of her backpack. He looked at it, copied her name and date of birth into a ledger, and pushed the card back. "I can open an account. I do not have wages yet. I did not ask about wages. I cannot promise when I can pay." "I did not ask for a promise either." He turned the ledger around. "You sign here. I put down what leaves the store. You bring money when money exists. You do not vanish. That is the whole arrangement." Iris looked at the page. Many names had been written there before hers, some crossed through, some marked paid, some carried forward in numbers that looked less like debt than weather. "Why would you do that?" "Mr. Haskell's mustache moved slightly. "Because I am 71 years old and tired of buildings being torn down by people who do not know how a nail works." She looked at him. "And because Elias Mercer once fixed my father's sled for nothing but a bowl of stew. He did that for many people. He did it well for many people, Mr." Haskell tapped the ledger. "Sign." She signed. He disappeared into the back and returned with a paper grocery bag, a narrow coil of wire, a stiff-bristled chimney brush with screw-on rods, a pair of leather work gloves too large for her, a small hand mirror, and a booklet with a torn cover. "A manual came free with a stove kit in 1978, he said. "You may keep it if you bring it back eventually." "That is not keeping." "No, it is a test." The title on the booklet read Practical Home Heat, Chimneys, Stoves and Safe Draft. The cover showed a smiling family beside a stove, all of them dressed too cleanly to have installed anything. Iris opened to the chimney chapter and saw diagrams of flue tiles, dampers, clean outdoors and creosote deposits drawn in thick black lines. Mr. Haskell began writing prices on a pad. "Chimney brush loaned, no charge unless you ruin it. Rods loaned, work gloves used, $2 on account, wire 8 feet 40 cents, flashlight batteries $1.20, stove cement $4.89, one 3-foot length, 6-inch black pipe, $12.50, one adjustable elbow, $7.30, sheet metal screws, 12 count, 55 cents, cotton lamp wick if you find oil, 30 cents, matches, 2 boxes, 60 cents, lentils, 1 pound, $1.10, salt, 25 cents, biscuit from May, not on account. He put each item on the counter as he named it. The total grew in his ledger with a calmness that made Iris's face hot. I cannot take all that. You can carry all that. That is different. Yes, he kept writing. It is. She swallowed. Mr. Haskell. He looked up. I mean to pay. I know. That is why I'm letting you owe. The woman from the back came out then, teeing a scarf around her hair. She was younger than him by perhaps 10 years, with flour on one sleeve and a face made direct by weather. She set a wrapped biscuit on the counter and added 2 boiled potatoes wrapped in newspaper. For the walk, she said. I cannot pay for those. I did not sell them. The store grew hushed around that small sentence. Iris took the bundle with both hands because one hand would have made it seem casual. Thank you. May Haskell glanced at her once, and whatever she saw made her look away first. There is no glory in being cold, she said, and went out the back door into the alley. Mr. Haskell packed the supplies into 2 canvas sacks and tied them so they could be carried over the shoulders. The chimney rods stuck out awkwardly above Iris's head. At the door he stopped her. You clean from the top if the roof is sound, from below if it is not. I'm guessing it is not. Yes, sir. Lay a cloth over the stove opening. Wire the brush steady. Short strokes. Do not twist so hard you unscrew a rod in the flue. Creosote falls heavier than you think. Wear something over your mouth. Test draft with a small flame before you build any fire worth naming. And if smoke comes back at you, you stop. Yes. Sir, say it. If smoke comes back, I stop. He nodded. Good. The walk back took most of the afternoon. The sacks cut into Iris's shoulders and altered her balance. Twice she had to set them down and stand breathing with her hands braced on her knees. The potatoes she ate cold beside the road, slowly, with salt from a paper twist. May had tucked into the bundle. She saved the biscuit until she reached the split walnut, then ate half of it there, facing the buried lane like a worker reporting to a foreman. By the time she reached the cabin, the light had begun to leave the clearing. She did not clean the chimney that night. Wanting warmth was not the same as earning it. She drank water, read the manual by the last of the window light, and slept with the booklet open on her chest. The chimney took nearly 6 hours the next day, and most of her certainty. The roof was not safe. She knew that by the way the rafters bowed under snow, by the black damp on the ceiling boards near the chimney, by the sound the porch roof made when a clump of snow slid from above and struck it, so she worked from below. First, she cleared the stovepipe completely, carrying each rusted section outside and tapping it gently with a piece of wood, until flakes of black scale fell onto the snow. One pipe had a hole near the seam big enough for her thumb that would be replaced. Another could be used if turned carefully and sealed. She laid the canvas drop cloth over the hearth, then added a second barrier made from flattened feed sacks found in the shed. She tied one of Elias's old bandanas, found hanging stiff behind the workroom door, across her nose and mouth. It smelled of dust and long-faded sweat. She did not let herself consider whose hands had tied it last. The chimney's clean-out door was low on the east wall, behind a warped panel. She found it by tapping stone until one sound changed. The iron door resisted the first pull, the second and the third. On the fourth, after she worked stove cement loose from the edges with a screwdriver Haskell had lent her, it opened and spilled a mound of soot across the hearthcloth. The soot was not soft, it came in flakes and chunks, glossy black and brown, some as thick as bark. Creosote, the manual had said, condensed from smoke that cooled too soon. It clung, hard and weighted. Enough of it could burn like oil inside a chimney and take a roof before a person understood the sound. Iris shoveled the debris into the old paint can, carried it outside, and dumped it far from the cabin where snow swallowed it in a black wound. Then she assembled the rods. The brush was round, wire-bristled, and slightly wider than the flue opening. It did not want to enter. She worked it upward with both hands, pushing a few inches, pulling back, pushing again. Soot rained down almost immediately, striking the cloth with a dry patter. Her shoulders burned before the first hour ended. At every rod joint she stopped and tightened carefully, remembering Haskell's warning. She did not twist hard, she did not hurry what had to hold. By noon her arms trembled, her face was streaked black above the bandana. Creosote had worked inside her cuffs and under her nails. She rested on the floor with her back against the cot frame and read the same paragraph of the manual 3 times. A flue may appear clear at the bottom while remaining obstructed near the shoulder. Continue brushing until the sound changes and debris lessens. The sound changed in the 5th hour. At first, the brush moved with a muffled scrape, thick and stubborn. Then, after a shower of soot and one hard clatter that made her jump back, the rods slid higher and the scrape sharpened. Air moved against her face. Not much. Enough. She used the hand mirror next, angling it into the clean-out while holding the flashlight in her teeth. The reflected light showed rough stone, soot-stained but open. No bird nest. No fallen brick, though one mortar joint looked deeply hollow. Temporary, then. Safe enough for a test. Not safe enough for pride. She reattached the better pipe with the new elbow, sealed one seam with stove cement, and drove 3 sheet metal screws with a stubby screwdriver until her wrist ached. The hole in the older pipe she patched with a piece cut from a tin lid and wired tight, knowing it would not last but might carry her until a proper length could be bought. By the time the pipe stood upright from stove to chimney, the room had gone blue with evening. The first fire was no larger than a teacup. She placed 3 curls of birch bark in the firebox. Then a handful of dry splinters shaved from the underside of the work table where the wood had stayed sound. She struck a match. It flared sulphur yellow, then steadied. She touched it to the bark and closed the stove door halfway. Smoke rose. Hesitated. Drew backward for one breath that stopped her own. Then the flue caught. The flame bent toward the pipe. Iris sat on her heels and watched the draft take hold with the seriousness other people might give a sunrise. The stove ticked as metal warmed. A faint ribbon of smoke escaped from one pipe seam, then vanished as the draft strengthened. She waited 10 minutes before adding 2 finger-thick sticks, then 2 more. The fire remained small, disciplined, exact. Warmth did not fill the room. It began at the stove and moved outward by inches. It reached her hands first, then her knees, then the air just above the floor. The smell of the cabin changed as heat entered it. Cedar waking, dust lifting, iron remembering its work. For supper she boiled lentils in the old paint can after scrubbing it once more and burning it dry. The lentils took longer than the package claimed because the stove was cautious and the room was cold. She added salt, half the biscuit, and 1 strip of birch bark as a lid weight when steam kept lifting the tin plate she used for cover. When the lentils finally softened, she ate from a chipped enamel cup found on the shelf, each spoonful plain, hot, and difficult to believe. That night she slept 4 hours without waking. On the 4th morning, with fire now possible and hunger held at a distance, Iris began the inventory of the workroom. She did not rummage. Rummaging belonged to people who did not expect meaning. She started at the door and moved clockwise, writing with a library pencil on the back of a county notice. Shelf 1 held 6 jars of cut tacks, 2 empty, 1 cracked, 3 usable. Shelf 2 held rawhide scraps so dry they had curled inward like dead leaves. Shelf 3 held a tin of brass brads, an awl handle without its point, a wooden gauge marked in 1/4 inches, a half-full bottle of hide glue turned dark as molasses, and a bundle of cane splints tied with string. Against the south wall were the snowshoe forms, bear paw, beaver tail, Alaskan, and a narrow child's form no longer than her forearm. Each had pencil notations along its edge, some smudged, some still legible. Toe rise 2 1/4, tail dree 36 HR, do not force. One form carried 3 initials burned into the underside, EMM. Elias's full name had been Elias Matthew Mercer. Iris touched those letters once with 2 fingers, then wrote them down without trusting herself to linger. Under the bench she found a rawhide soaking trough, dry but sound, made from galvanized tin set into a wooden frame. There were clamps with wooden screws, 2 broken draw knives, a spoke shave whose blade had been wrapped in oiled cloth and survived better than the others, and a box of leather harness scraps too brittle for use but good for patterns. On the wall above the bench hung 3 templates cut from thin pine. One was labelled Rescue Shoe, Wide Web. Another read, Child Carrier Sled Crosspiece. The third had no label, only a row of holes and a long curve that felt familiar in the hand. She set it aside. The toboggans took longer. There were 7 in the shed if broken ones counted, and Iris counted broken things because a broken thing could still teach the shape of its making. 2 were utility sleds, straight and heavy, with iron rub strips worn thin. One was a child's sled, painted blue long ago, its paint now reduced to traces in the grain. 3 were work toboggans, maple planked, cross-braced with ash, their curled noses held by rawhide lashings and copper rivets. The last was the longest, nearly 8 feet, resting across sawhorses beneath the stiff canvas. It was better made than the others. She noticed that before she knew why, the curl was even. The boards had been matched by grain and colour. The crosspieces were not nailed but pegged and wedged. The rawhide lashings, though dry, had been set in a pattern both practical and almost decorative, crossing at exact intervals. Along one side, burned small near the rear crossbar, was the same horseshoe-like craft mark that appeared on 2 forms and the underside of the bench. She wrote, Long Maple Toboggan, covered. Good workmanship. Heavy. Then she stood with the pencil in her hand and frowned. Heavy. All toboggans were heavy. Maple had weight. Old rawhide, moisture, dust and iron could add more. But this one rested on the sawhorses differently. The front support had sunk a half-inch into the floor. The rear horse had been shimmed with cedar wedges, not carelessly but with intention, as if someone long ago had wanted the sled level despite its weight. Iris set the pencil down. She lifted the child's sled first to understand the ordinary weight of the room. It came up easily, no more than a few pounds. One utility sled required effort but moved as expected, its weight distributed along the length. Then she returned to the long maple toboggan and placed both hands under the side rail. It barely shifted. She tried again, bracing one knee against the sawhorse. The sled rose perhaps an inch, then settled with a low wooden sound that did not belong to a hollow piece of equipment. She stood back and listened to her own breathing. The manual had taught her to test chimneys by sound. Elias had taught her to test wood the same way. Not with drama, with patience. She took the handle of the broken awl and tapped the first board near the curled nose. A clear note answered. She tapped the second, clear, third, clear, along the side rail, clear across the first 3 crosspieces, a dry, honest knock. Then, near the centre underside, where 2 maple boards met beneath the 4th crosspiece, the sound changed. It was lower. Dula. She tapped again. The same. There was a cedar disc set into the underside of the centre crosspiece, no wider than a silver dollar, and darkened by age until it looked like a knot. She had missed it at first because the grain had been stained to match. Now, with her face close and the flashlight angled low, she saw the circle's edge. Not a knot, a plug. The cedar was softer than the maple around it. Someone had cut it exact, tapped it into place, and sealed the rim with a mixture of hide glue and fine dust. The work was so careful that only weight and sound had betrayed it. Iris did not open it then. She went back into the cabin, added 2 sticks to the stove, drank water, and sat on the cot with both hands between her knees until the first urge passed. Hunger made people tear things apart. Fear made them foolish. Hope made them worse than both. When she returned, she brought the spokeshave blade, the screwdriver, a cup of warm water, and the patience she had left. She softened the seam first, touching water to the cedar plug with a rag, then waiting. The shed remained colder than the cabin, and the water cooled almost at once. She warmed the rag near the stove and tried again. After 20 minutes, the glue line darkened. She worked the screwdriver tip under one edge and stopped when the cedar began to splinter. Wrong tool, wrong angle. The awl point was missing, but one broken draw knife had a narrow tang that could be wrapped in cloth and used gently. She slid it along the rim, not prying yet, only clearing what time had hardened. Fine dust lifted. The circle became more visible. She pressed. The plug moved less than the thickness of a fingernail. Another 10 minutes. Warm rag. Tang. Pause. By the time the plug came free, dusk had entered the shed. It did not pop or spring away. It released with a faint sigh and dropped into her palm. Behind it was a hole bored through the crosspiece and into the hollowed core of the toboggan. Inside the hole, something wrapped in oilcloth waited. Iris stood very still. The opening was too narrow for her hand. She bent a piece of wire into a hook, tested the curve against her finger, and slid it in. The first package resisted, then shifted. She drew it toward the hole inch by inch until she could pinch the edge of the oilcloth and pull it free. It was long, narrow, and tied with blackened linen thread. She carried it into the cabin before unwrapping it because the stove light felt more honest than the shed dark. She set it on the work table, washed her hands in cold water, though they would not come clean, and untied the thread without cutting it. Inside lay tools? Not many, not valuable to anyone who did not understand use. A crooked knife with a birch handle worn to the shape of a palm, 2 bone-lacing needles polished by fingers, a small brass awl with its point still keen, a rawhide gauge made from antler, notched in exact widths, a folding rule with one hinge repaired in copper wire. Each had been oiled, wrapped, and kept from rust or rot by a care that seemed almost personal. Under the tools was a folded paper labelled in brown ink, for the hands that need them. Iris did not open the paper. The handwriting alone made her sit down. It was not Elias's hand exactly. Older, more formal. But there was a family resemblance in the slant of the M, in the firm downward strokes, in the way practical words received beautiful care. She went back to the sled. The second package was broader and heavier. It took longer to draw through the hole, and once it caught so firmly that she had to stop, breathe, and push it back before trying a different angle. When it emerged, the oilcloth left black dust on her sleeve. Inside were raw materials, rawhide coils wrapped in waxed linen, thin ash splints bound flat, a small paper packet of copper rivets, a twist of sinew, and 2 cakes of something pale and waxy that smelled faintly of tallow and pine resin. The third object was not wrapped in cloth. It was a tin box. The box had been made for tobacco once, judging by the faint embossed lettering under rust and grease. It was larger than her hand, sealed around the rim with wax darkened nearly black. Iris turned it over and found no label. Her fingers shook then, not wildly, but enough that the box clicked against the table when she set it down. She could have waited. A patient person might have waited until morning. A careful person might have opened the folded paper first, might have made tea if there had been tea, might have prepared herself for disappointment or history. But hunger, cold, fear, and the long discipline of not asking for anything had brought her to this table with a sealed box beneath her hands. Carefulness did not require refusal. She warmed the wax near the stove. Not close enough to melt it into the seam, only enough to soften. Then she used the brass awl from the first package and worked around the lid. The box opened with a dry click. Money lay inside, wrapped in bundles no bank would have accepted without questions. There were bills, old and newer though none recent, 10s, 20s, 50s, some silver certificates with blue seals, some Federal Reserve notes folded flat and banded with paper gone brittle. Beneath them were coins in cloth rolls and loose inside a smaller tin, Mercury dimes, standing Liberty quarters worn smooth at the dates, silver Washington quarters, walking Liberty $half, Franklin halves, and 4 Morgan dollars wrapped separately in tissue. At one end of the box lay a medal on a faded ribbon, dark bronze, its bar marked 1944. Iris put both hands flat on the table. Outside, the creek spoke under ice. Inside, the stove burned low. She could hear nothing else. Counting required order, so order saved her from understanding too quickly. She cleared the table. She stacked the bills by denomination. She opened only the coin rolls that had already split, leaving intact those still sealed by old paper. She wrote each amount on the back of the county notice, then added twice, then a third time when the second sum matched the first and frightened her. $50,000.73. The odd cents came from the loose coins, 3 wheat pennies, 1 nickel dark with age, and the half-worn dimes she counted under her breath. The total looked impossible in pencil, too large for the small table, too large for the room with its cracked chimney and patched pipe, too large for a woman whose supper had been lentils and bread crust. She did not cheer. She did not cry out. The body sometimes receives deliverance the way frozen ground receives rain, slowly and with resistance. She placed the money back in the box exactly as she had found it, except for 1 Morgan dollar she held in her palm for a long while. It was dated 1903, the silver worn at the eagle's breast. She turned it over with her thumb until it warmed. Then she returned it to the tissue. The medal she left on the table. It was not polished. The ribbon had faded from what might once have been red and blue into a tired brown violet. The word across the top was difficult to read by stovelight, but the year was clear, 1944. There was a name engraved on the back in letters so small she had to use the hand mirror to catch them. J. A. Mercer. She copied the initials beneath the money total and stopped there. The folded paper remained unopened beside the tools. Another package still waited inside the toboggan's hollow core, this one flatter farther back and harder to draw free. Iris worked at it until her fingers lost feeling, then stopped because force had no place in that room now. She sealed the tin box in the deed envelope, wrapped the tools again, and placed everything beneath the cot, then moved the cot 2 inches so one leg stood over the loose floorboard she had marked firm on the first day. After that, she sat beside the stove and looked at the folded paper on the table. The paper waited. It had waited longer than she had been alive. It could wait one more night. She rose, put on both sweaters and the oversized gloves, and carried the medal outside. The clearing had entered full dark, but the moon was behind thin clouds, and the snow held what little light there was. The cabin stood at her back, with one faint glow at the stovepipe seam, where warmth met metal. The woods were still. No wind moved the branches. The creek beneath the ice made a sound like cloth being torn very slowly, then mended by water. Iris walked toward that sound until the snow deepened and the trees opened enough for her to see the creek. It was narrow black where the current had kept a seam free, white along the stones. Water moved under shelves of ice, patient and exact, finding passage through a world determined to close over it. She stood there with the medal in her hand. The money changed many things, and because it changed many things, she was afraid to touch it too quickly. It could buy shingles, pipe, glass, food, boots that did not leak. It could also ruin the one honest thing that had happened, if she began to treat it as escape instead of responsibility. She knew that without wording it, Elias's shop, the county clerk's warning, Haskell's ledger, May's biscuit, Pritchard's matches, the hidden work of unknown hands inside a sled built to carry weight, all of it had placed something before her that was not simply money. It was a burden made bearable by being kept. She stayed by the creek until her feet hurt badly enough to send her back. At the cabin door she turned once and looked at the clearing, the buried lane, the split shadows of walnut and hemlock. Then she went inside, set the medal beside the folded paper, banked the fire as well as she knew how, and lay on the cot without reading the letter. The house had been waiting. Morning came without warmth, but it came clean. A thin light entered through the south window and lay across the work table, touching the brass awl first, then the folded paper, then the medal with its tired ribbon. The stove had fallen to coals. Frost stood along the inside of the glass in white ferns, each one more delicate than anything the room had sheltered in years. Iris rose slowly because the cold punished haste. Her boots were stiff, her fingers had split again at 2 knuckles. The cabin smelled of ash, wet wool, and the faint mineral odour of old money returned to air. She did not reach for the paper at once. First, she opened the stove and coaxed the coals with cedar shavings until a small flame accepted them. Then she warmed the cup of water left from the night before, drank half and used the rest to wipe soot from her hands. The water turned grey in the enamel basin. Still, when she unfolded the paper, she did it with fingers as careful as she could make them. The sheet had been folded into eighths along creases gone soft at the edges. It was not one sheet, but several, sewn at the corner with brown thread. The ink had faded from black to the colour of walnut hulls. The first page bore no address, no county seal, no legal marking. Only words written in a steady hand. She knew then that it was not a note. It was a keeping. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then the sled carried its last load better than I had any right to expect. I hid these things not because I loved secrets, but because the world has a way of taking from quiet houses when no one is there to answer the door. I have grown old enough to know that papers can be burned, barns can be emptied, and good tools can be sold for less than the price of a supper by someone who does not know the years held in a handle. So I have put this little inheritance where only a patient hand might find it. My name is Abigail Jane Mercer, born Abigail Snow in 1881 in Minerva, New York, daughter of Ruth Bell Snow and Caleb Snow, who came down from Vermont in 1849 with 2 oxen, 1 copper kettle, and more stubbornness than bedding. I married Thomas Mercer in 1902, whose father, Josiah Mercer, was born near North River in 1856, and whose mother, Elspeth McLean Mercer, came as a child from Glengarry County, Ontario, with the old songs still in her mouth. Josiah's father, Ansel Mercer, settled near Tahawus before the mines changed the road, and he learned to bend ash from an Abenaki trapper named Noel Wawanale, who told him that a shoe which bruises the snow will betray the traveller. That is 4 generations if the counting is generous, and 5 if gratitude is allowed its own place at the table. I write this in the autumn of 1961, after Dr. Harold Benning in Glens Falls told me what my own body had already been saying in smaller words. He named the sickness and wrote it in his chart, and I will not honour it by giving it more room here than it deserves. I have some months perhaps, or a year if winter is merciful. My hands still work in the morning, by evening they swell, and the bones complain under the skin. That is enough knowing. The trade began closing before I did. On March 12, 1936, after 3 days of rain over snow, the North Trail to the Santanoni camps broke through in 4 places, and the county bought 2 motor sleds the following winter. Men said it was progress, and perhaps it was. A motor does not tire. A machine does not remember who taught it. After that, orders came only from guides, trappers, and families too poor to buy new ways. Then the war took leather, metal, and men. The young ones came home wanting roads ploughed wide enough for automobiles. I do not blame them. A man who has crossed Europe in mud may be forgiven for wanting dry socks and a straight road home. Thomas died in 1918 before I had learned how long a house can echo after one chair is empty. My brother Samuel was lost in the Meuse-Argonne that same year, though the telegram used cleaner words than lost. Our son James Ansel Mercer wore a uniform in the next war and came back from Italy with a limp, a bronze star, and a silence that sat beside him at supper. He died in 1950 of a winter fever he would have survived as a boy. Grief is not one storm, it is weather. For 31 years after Thomas was buried, I kept the shop because the shop kept me. I bent ash when there were no orders. I laced rawhide when there was no buyer. I repaired rescue sleds for men who said they would settle up later and sometimes did. I drew winter routes on paper because the mountain paths are older than town roads, and because someone should know how to reach a cabin when snow has swallowed the summer track. If you mean to work here, remember this. Fell black ash when the sap is down, after 3 hard frosts, split by the annual ring, not across it. Steam thin stock at 200 degrees, no less than 1 hour for each inch of thickness, though narrow shoe frames ask for more judgment than rule. Bend while the wood is hot enough to smell green. Do not force the toe. Clamp it to the form and let it dry 3 days near heat, but never beside flame. For rawhide, soak until it yields without going limp. Cut lacing wet, 1/4 inch for common shoes, 3/8 for rescue webs. Keep the crossing pattern honest. Too open and the foot sinks, too tight and snow cakes beneath. Rub finished lacing with tallow, beeswax and pine rosin in equal measure, warmed only until it blends. If you make a toboggan nose, steam maple longer than pride permits, bend with 2 straps and listen. Wood speaks before it breaks. The money is not treasure, it is stored labour. Some came from shoes, some from sleds, some from guiding men richer than wisdom through snow they had no business entering. Spend it slowly, use it to keep the roof from falling, to buy glass, to feed yourself, while your hands learn what they have forgotten. Leave what you can for the next unknown person. There is always a next one. That is the only way a house remains a house after bloodlines scatter and surnames thin. Inheritance is not ownership. Though lawyers prefer the easier word, inheritance is attention received and then passed on without making too much noise about it. If you're kin, welcome. If you are not kin, welcome. A name is only one door. Need is another. Care is the oldest. Behind the cabin, in the walnut split by lightning, Thomas set a horseshoe when the tree was young. I have put a mark there for memory. Do not trouble it unless the house has taught you patience first. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Abigail Jane Mercer, October 3, 1961. Iris read the letter once while standing. Then she sat down because her knees had altered their agreement with her. The stove clicked. A coal dropped inward. Somewhere in the shed, snow slid from one board to another with a dry hush. She held the pages open on her lap and looked not at the words now but at the ink itself, at the pressure of a hand that had crossed paper before Iris had crossed any road, before her mother was born, before Elias had grown old enough to bend ash in his own shed. She read it again. The second reading took longer, not because the words had changed, but because each one had begun to attach itself to something in the room. The brass awl, the forms, the toboggan, the cedar plug lying on the table like a small removed seal, the medal, the money, the chimney that had drawn smoke because she had cleaned it with borrowed tools and blackened hands. The letter did not make the cabin kind, it made it exact. When she finished, she folded the pages along the original creases, never making a new one. Her fingers knew to do that before the rest of her gave the order. She wrapped the letter in its oilcloth, then paused and unwrapped it again because hiding it felt wrong. Instead, she placed it on the work table beneath the brass awl, weighted by usefulness. Only then did she take the medal outside. The back door had swollen in its frame and opened with a sound like cloth tearing. Beyond it, the ground sloped toward the creek, then rose again under hemlock and walnut. Morning had brightened. The snow was hard enough to hold her for 3 steps, then broke at the 4th. She moved slowly, following the line of trees mentioned in the letter, looking for the walnut split by lightning. She had passed it before from the road, but from the cabin side it seemed different, larger, more deliberate. The trunk divided low, 1/2 living, 1/2 dead and silver, the wound between them sealed by decades of growth. Snow had collected in the split like folded linen. Near shoulder height, half swallowed by bark, was the curve of iron, a horseshoe. Not nailed above a door this time, not arranged for luck, but pressed into the living trunk where the tree had grown around it. Only the outer rim showed, dark and rough, the nail heads absorbed into wood. Beneath it, cut faintly into the bark and nearly closed by healing, was the same craft mark burned onto the sled and forms, a curved shoe shape crossed by a single line. Iris brushed snow from the trunk with her sleeve. The bark was cold under her palm, ridged and patient. She leaned close but did not pry, did not scratch at the seam, did not search for what the letter had told her not to trouble. The house had not taught her patience yet. It had only begun. She stood there a long while with the medal in her gloved hand and the creek speaking below. When she returned inside, light had shifted to the back wall of the workroom. Dust moved in it like fine ash. She warmed her hands at the stove, then opened the tin box again, not for the money but for the smaller things tucked along one side, a sewing needle, a folded square of linen, a stub of sealing wax, and wrapped in tissue gone brown, a candle no longer than her finger, beeswax darkened by age. It had a label in the same hand from Christmas 1901, saved for a dark hour. The wick had leaned sideways in the wax and hardened there. Iris held it near the stove until it softened enough to straighten. She set it in a chipped saucer, touched one of Pritchard's matches to the wick, and watched the small flame take. The candle burned low and honey-coloured. It gave almost no heat and very little light. Still the room changed. The work table, the tools, the letter, the stove, the snowshoe forms on the wall, each seemed to step closer, not transformed but acknowledged. A candle saved for more than half a century had entered its appointed hour without ceremony. Iris placed Elena's photograph beside it. For the first time since the porch, she turned the frame upright and looked at her mother's face through the clouded glass. The water damage had softened one side of Elena's mouth and blurred the line of her hair. It made her appear farther away than death alone had done. Iris did not ask the photograph for explanation. She had spent too many nights asking locked doors to become voices. Instead, she set the letter beside the frame and let the two silences sit near each other. That afternoon she cleaned without planning to. The body, when it cannot contain a feeling, sometimes chooses labour and survives by it. She swept the front room again, more thoroughly now, pushing dust toward the door in patient grey rows. She cleared one shelf for the heirloom tools, not to display them but to keep them dry. She lined the shelf with old newspaper from beneath a drawer, then oiled the brass awl lightly with a rag and placed it beside the bone needles. She set the medal above them. The ribbon lay flat against the wood. Then she made a list, not a dream list, not a spending list, a keeping list. Roof, chimney mortar, window glass, food, boots, saw, nails, rope, kettle, lantern, well, test, deed copy safe, letter tin. Haskell account, pay first. She wrote pay first twice. Not because anyone demanded it, but because obligation written down became less frightening than obligation left to swarm in the mind. By evening, the candle had shortened to a golden nub. She pinched the flame out before it reached the saucer and saved what remained. A dark hour might have more than one room. She ate lentils again and, because of the letter, they tasted less like scarcity than beginning. Not abundance. That would have been too easy a word. Beginning was harder. Beginning required the next nail, the next thaw, the next honest measurement. Before sleep she took out the county map and spread it beside Abigail's letter. The hand-drawn winter routes were not in the packages yet, only hinted at by the unopened flat bundle still trapped deeper in the toboggan. But the county map showed roads, creeks, old mine lines, private parcels, and blank spaces where places had once had names. Iris traced the road back to the clerk's office, then to Haskell's store, then to the barn where the coffee jar had been set on the ladder rung, then to the library bulletin board where the notice had waited among lost cats and church suppers. A chain. Not dramatic. not visible to those who had not walked it. The farmer's wife with the eggs, Miss Anson with the children's books, Mrs. Washburn with the dollar in the drawer, May Haskell with the biscuit and potatoes, Pritchard with his matches and the warning about the washout. Each had done something modest enough to deny later if praised too heavily. Each small thing had become a plank laid over deep snow. Here, if you're listening from your own kitchen, your own dim room, your own place where the day has asked more of you than you wanted to give, remember one small kindness you once received, not the grand rescue people tell at tables, the quieter one, a ride when you were too tired to ask twice, a sandwich wrapped in paper, a bill paid without a speech, a neighbour who shovelled your steps and left before you could thank him. Write it down if you can. Say the name aloud if you remember it. Some kindnesses are so small they are mistaken for weather, yet years later a person finds they were the path. Iris did not know whether gratitude could warm a room. She only knew the room felt less empty when she named what had brought her there. She prepared for sleep with care. The tin box went under the cot, wrapped in canvas and set behind a loose plank she could lift without tools. The letter went inside the tobacco tin only after she lined it with dry cloth. The heirloom tools stayed on the shelf near the stove where damp would trouble them least. The medal she placed beside the photograph. Because James Ansell Mercer had come home carrying a silence no one had named properly, and for that one night at least, someone could keep watch with him. Then Iris lay down on the rope cot with both sweaters on, boots loosened but not removed, gloves tucked beneath her cheek. The cabin settled around her. Wind moved over the roof without entering. In the shed, the long toboggan held its remaining secret in darkness. On the work table, the brass awl caught the last dull glow from the stove and returned it as a small, exact line. Iris slept with the heirlooms beside her. On December 6th, the first real snow after the letter came down all day and measured 11 inches by the stove poker, Iris pushed through it beside the porch. Not the powder that drifts and lies, this was weight-bearing snow, wet at first, then hardened when the temperature fell after dusk. It gathered on the roof in a white load and pressed the cabin into complaint. By midnight, the rafters began to speak, not loudly, a low tick from the east slope, a longer groan over the shed. Once, near 2 in the morning, the porch beam gave a sound like a knuckle cracking. Iris got up and dressed by stove light. She did not climb onto the roof. The old surface would not hold her. Instead she took the broom handle, wrapped the broken bristle head with cloth, and reached through the loft window to push snow from the lower edge where she could. Most of it stayed. Some came down in heavy pieces and struck the ground with the sound of damp laundry dropped from a height. By morning the shed roof bowed visibly between the rafters, the curve not new perhaps, but newly honest. That day she read the roofing chapter in Haskell's manual 3 times. The first reading gave her words. She learned eave, rake, valley, flashing, underlayment, exposure, drip edge, and sister rafter. The second reading gave her order. Remove loose snow, brace from beneath, strip failing shingles, inspect decking, repair rafters, lay felt, run courses true, flash the chimney, keep water moving down and away. The third reading gave her fear its proper size, not gone, measured. She drew the roof on brown paper torn from May Haskell's grocery bag. The main cabin was roughly 24 by 16, with a steep pitch that turned each side into a rectangle longer than it appeared from below. The shed roof added another 18 by 12, lower and more dangerous because water had entered where the 2 structures joined. She measured by pacing, then by twine, then by pacing again, and wrote the numbers in pencil until they stopped changing. At Haskell Hardware. Mr. Haskell looked over her drawing without smiling. You measured the slope or the floor? The floor first. Then estimated rise. Estimate is a draft, not a roof. Yes, sir. He sent her back with a borrowed folding rule, a plumb bob made from a fishing weight, and instructions to measure from ridge to eave along the actual plane. She did. The main slopes were nearly 14 feet each. The shed was wider on one end than the other by 3 inches. The kind of old error made by human hands and weather, not carelessness. The material list came out in columns. 9 bundles of cedar shingles for the main cabin, 3 for the shed patching. If she reused what remained sound, 2 rolls of 15-pound roofing felt, 1 roll of galvanized flashing, 12 inches wide, 5 pounds of 1¼ inch hot-dipped galvanized roofing nails, 2 pounds of 2½ inch common nails for rafter work, 16 feet of 2x6 spruce for sistering, a chalk line, a utility knife, roofing cement, a small pry bar, tarps, rope. The total in Mr. Haskell's ledger looked like a weather report no one wanted to hear. "You cannot do it all before Christmas," he said. "I have to make it last until spring." "That is a different sentence." "Yes, sir." He looked at the list, then went into the back room. Iris heard wood moved, metal shifted, a drawer pulled hard enough to complain. When he returned, he carried a hatchet with a square pole, a short curved handle, and a head darkened by use. "Roofing hatchet," he said, "belonged to my Uncle Marden. He could set a cedar shingle faster than any man in Essex County and swear without repeating himself for 40 minutes. Iris took it carefully. The handle had been worn hollow near the throat by someone's thumb. "I cannot buy this. I did not offer to sell it. I can borrow it. You can use it." That was as far as he would go. And Iris understood enough by then not to make gratitude cumbersome. The skilled elder came 2 mornings later, walking up the lane on snowshoes older than Iris, with a tool belt over his wool coat and a face nearly hidden by a grey beard. He appeared while she was clearing the porch roof from below, and stood at the edge of the clearing until she saw him. A red cap sat low over his ears, his left shoulder was lower than his right. He carried a thermos under one arm. "You Mercer?" "Yes, sir." "Name is Lyle Cushing. Haskell says you're trying to die under cedar." "I am trying not to." He looked up at the roof, then down at her boots, then toward the shed. "Good. That is a teachable position." Mr. Cushing had roofed camps, barns, boathouses and churches for 43 years before his knees ended the ladder work. He would not take pay. Iris offered twice. The second time he turned his head and said, "Do not insult an old man before breakfast." After that she stopped offering directly and began setting coffee near his left hand when he came, though the coffee was weak and made in a borrowed kettle blackened from stove flame. They worked 11 days, not full days, because daylight was short and cold made tools treacherous. Mr. Cushing did not climb high. He directed from the ladder, from the porch, from the ground with his head tipped back and one eye narrowed. Iris climbed when the roof could carry her, and when it could not, they worked from planks laid across the rafters and braced from within. The worst place was over the shed joint. Water had entered there for years, slipped under old shingles, softened decking, and made one rafter punky near the wall plate. Mr. Cushing showed her how to sister it. The new 2x6 lay alongside the damaged rafter. Running past the weakness by 3 feet at either end, she drilled pilot holes because splitting the new wood would have wasted both board and hope. Then she fastened it with 2½ inch nails staggered in pairs, not lined up, because a line of nails could become a split waiting for weather. "Flush," he said. She tapped the board. Not almost. She drove the nail. "That nail's proud." She set the hammer down. "Pull it." "Good." He taught her the chalk line next. Snap from the bottom course, measure the exposure, keep the reveal steady even when the old roof wandered. Cedar shingles were not laid by wishing them straight. They were persuaded by string, eye and repetition. He taught her the 3-stroke nail: set, drive, seat. Not hard enough to crush the shingle, not shallow enough to invite wind. Set. She tapped. Drive. She struck. Seat. She finished. He grunted. Again. By the 4th day, the rhythm entered her wrist. By the 6th, she could tell from the sound whether the nail had entered sound decking or tired wood beneath. By the 8th, her knees were bruised from crawling, her palms blistered under gloves, and her shoulders ached when she lifted the kettle. She worked anyway, not from courage, but from sequence. The next course waited, then the next, then the next. Once, near the end of the 9th day, Snow began while they were still on the shed slope. Mr. Cushing told her to stop. Iris had 3 shingles left in the course and wanted to finish. He looked at her over the ladder rail. Pride leaks. She climbed down. On December 17th, the last ridge cap was nailed under a sky as clear and hard as glass. The chimney flashing was not beautiful, but it overlapped properly, tucked where it needed to tuck, and shed a cup of test water without letting any through. Mr. Cushing made her pour 3 more cups from different angles before he accepted it. Then he climbed down, wiped his nose with a red handkerchief, and looked up at the roof. It will do, from him. Like Elias, that was enough. Iris stood beside him in the clearing and watched thin smoke rise from the newly guarded chimney. The roof no longer bowed under the morning snow. It stood with an exhausted dignity, patched and uneven, yet deliberate. The cedar shingles were new in patches, pale honey against the older weathered grey, so the cabin looked not restored but bandaged. That suited her. Mr. Cushing took his thermos from the porch rail and began walking toward the lane. "You forgot your hatchet," Iris called. He did not turn. "No, I did not." January arrived with a cold that made every metal thing in the cabin seem to withdraw from touch. The roof held through 2 storms, and because it held, the chimney became impossible to ignore. The first fire after New Year's Day drew cleanly at first, then gave a faint bitterness that did not belong to wood smoke. Iris went outside and saw smoke escaping from a joint in the fieldstone where mortar had powdered away under freeze and thaw. The chimney did not lean, but it had begun to loosen stone by stone from the weather side. Several bricks near the flue shoulder had spalled, their faces flaking off in orange-red scales. Mortar at the cap could be scraped out with a fingernail. She took samples to Haskell in a folded envelope. He poured the crumbs onto the counter and touched them with the pencil tip. "Portland patch over lime," he said. "Someone tried to fix it wrong in the 70s. Maybe. Hard mortar on soft masonry. Traps water. Then winter takes its fee. What should it be? Hydraulic lime for the outer joints. Fire clay mix near heat. Sand sharp enough to lock. Not beach sand. Never beach sand." He wrote the recipe slowly. For exterior appointing, 1 part natural hydraulic lime, 2 1/2 parts washed sharp sand, dampened, not drowned. For firebox and flue-adjacent joints, 1 part fireclay, 1 part lime, 3 parts sand, with a handful of wood ash sifted fine if the old work was soft enough to ask for it. Rake joints to sound material. Mist the stone, pack in lifts, keep from freezing until set. "That last part is the problem," he said. The temperature stayed in the 20s by day and often lower. Mortar did not cure kindly in that weather. It froze, crumbled, or lied about being set until spring revealed the failure. Iris built a temporary windbreak with feed sacks, scrap boards, and 1 tarp weighted by stones. She warmed small batches of mix near the stove, carried them outside in the dented kettle, and worked only when the sun touched the east wall. 3 weeks of chimney work taught her a different patience than the roof. Roofing moved in visible courses. Mortar disappeared into joints and asked to be trusted. She raked out failed material with a bent screwdriver and an old triangular file. She brushed each joint clean with Haskell's wire brush. She misted stone lightly with well water warmed, just enough not to freeze at once. She packed mortar with a narrow pointing trowel, pressing from the back of the joint forward, filling voids she could not see. Every 15 minutes, her bare fingers went numb. Gloves were too clumsy for the final packing. She wore them for raking and mixing, then stripped them off for the joints, working fast until sensation retreated from the fingertips and left behind a wooden ache. Then she would step inside, hold her hands near the stove but not too near, and wait for the pain of returning blood. It came as needles. She accepted it without drama. The chimney was accepting worse. The spalling bricks near the shoulder had to be replaced. Mr. Haskell found 3 salvaged fire bricks behind his store and added them to the ledger at 10 cents each, though one still had old mortar clinging to it. Iris carried them home in her backpack, the weight thudding against her spine. She cut out the failed bricks with hammer and chisel, cleaned the pocket, buttered the replacement with fireclay mix, and tapped each one into place with the wooden handle of the hatchet until the faces sat slightly proud, as Haskell had instructed, because old work rarely respected modern flatness. At night she covered the fresh mortar with burlap and hung a lantern near the chimney base inside, not for light, but for a little steady warmth. The lantern used kerosene she bought in small amounts, and each cup of fuel made her feel the ledger widening. She used it anyway. A failed repair would cost more than caution. On January 24th, the test fire began with 1 twist of paper and 3 cedar shavings. Iris watched the smoke through the open stove door, then outside from the clearing, then inside again, with the hand mirror angled at the pipe seam. The draft rose cleanly, no smoke seeped from the repointed joints. The new bricks darkened with heat and held. She added small wood, waited, added larger pieces, waited again. By afternoon the stove had accepted a proper fire. Outside, the smoke went up in a narrow blue column, clean and steady against the white trees. Iris stood in the snow until her feet grew cold and watched it. There was no audience for the moment, no certificate, no one to say that the chimney had been persuaded back into service by a woman who had once slept in a bus station restroom and now knew the difference between lime and cement by touch. The silence around the cabin held the fact without embellishment. Inside, she wrote in the ledger she kept for herself, January 24th. Chimney draws clean. Pay Haskell when able. Then she underlined clean once, because the word mattered. The floor waited until late January, and by then Iris had learned that every repair revealed the next honest injury. With the roof shedding water and the chimney drawing safely, the floorboards could no longer be excused as merely aged. Along the north wall, 3 white pine planks had cupped so badly the edges stood up like shallow ridges. Near the shed door, damp had softened the ends where snowmelt once blew under the threshold. The central boards were better hand-cut and wide, fastened with rose-head nails that had darkened nearly black. Those nails deserved saving. The rotten ends did not. Mr. Haskell had white pine in the loft of his store, planks left from a camp repair, not new enough for expensive people, and not poor enough for burning. He sold her 6 lengths at a price he wrote without looking at her face. The boards were 12 inches wide, thick and fragrant when cut. He also found a small paper sack of salvaged rose-head nails, irregular and handsome, pulled from a farmhouse near Lewis before demolition. Pre-drill, he said. Old-style nails split new pine if you act like TV taught you carpentry. I do not have a TV. Then you're ahead. Replacing boards was louder than chimney work. Iris lifted the damaged planks with the small pry bar, working around each old nail, rocking slowly, saving what could be saved. Some nails came free with a cry, some snapped and had to be driven below the surface. Beneath the boards she found old mouse nests, black dust, a lost button made of shell, and one child's marble green as creek ice. She placed the marble on the shelf beside the candle nub. It had no known story, but it had stayed. She cut the replacement pine with a handsaw, planned the edges where the cabin's angles refused neatness, and set each plank with a thin gap for seasonal movement. The rose-head nails were driven in pairs at the joists, their heads catching the light after the final tap. Not perfect. Honest. Then came sanding. The random orbit sander from Haskell's store cost $14 a day to rent, and he made a ceremony of pretending the machine was difficult to reserve, though it had clearly not left the back room in months. He gave her sanding discs in 3 grits, 80, 120, 220. Do not start fine, he said. Fine paper on rough wood is vanity. She began with 80 grit. The machine bucked in her hands at first, skittering when she let pressure shift. It made a sound that filled the cabin and drove dust into every seam of clothing. She wore the bandana over her face again, tied tight at the back, and worked in sections. The first pass removed splinters, old stains, grey raised grain, and the worst unevenness between boards. The floor emerged in patches, not new, not young, but legible. Knots appeared like closed eyes. Saw marks remained where they were too deep to erase without stealing history. The 120 pass took longer because it asked for attention rather than force. She moved with the grain, overlapping circles, stopping often to sweep dust from the surface and check with her palm. By the time she reached 220, the cabin had changed underfoot. The boards no longer caught her socks. The safe paths she had memorized during the first days widened into a whole room she could cross without listening for betrayal at every step. Oil came next. Mr. Haskell offered polyurethane. Iris bought tung oil and boiled linseed oil instead. After reading the old notes on the underside of one snowshoe form, equal patience, unequal shine, the note had said. Though she could not tell whether it was instruction or opinion, she mixed the first coat thin and rubbed it in with cloth, kneeling board by board. The pine drank it quickly, pale wood deepened to dark honey, older boards, rich with a century of smoke, hand oils, ash dust and winter damp, shifted toward mahogany in the knots and grain. The second coat came 48 hours later after curing, then the third 2 days after that. Between coats she buffed by hand with worn cloth, until the surface held a low glow, not polished, only fed. During those days she slept in the shed on the repaired cot, because the oil smell was strong and the front room needed air. The shed was colder, but the long toboggan stood near enough to seem watchful. She had not yet removed the flat bundle hidden deeper inside it. She would, but not until the floor was ready to receive whatever it held. This was not superstition. It was order. Then came the bad morning. It was January 31st, though she did not write the date until later. She woke before dawn with her hands swollen from sanding and her back stiff enough that sitting up required both elbows. The stove had gone out. The water in the basin wore a skin of ice. The third oil coat had cured unevenly near the north wall, because the night had dropped colder than the forecast pinned in Haskell's window. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at the floor, the shelves, the tools, the chimney, the roofline, the paper list with its unpaid columns. The next task waited. Then the next after that. Waiting was sometimes mercy and sometimes burden. She put on her coat and walked out without eating. Beyond the creek, past a stand of young spruce, lay a marsh she had seen only from a distance, a flat white opening where cattails stood with brown heads above the snow. The path to it was not a path, only deer passage and low branches. Iris walked until the cabin disappeared behind trees. At the marsh edge, a fallen log offered a seat silvered by frost. She sat there as the morning came up. For a long time nothing moved then. From the dark line of open water near the centre, a great blue heron lifted itself from among the reeds. It should have been gone south, perhaps. Or perhaps it knew a pocket of water that did not freeze, a winter rule hidden from human sense. Its wings opened slowly, wide and deliberate, and for 3 beats it seemed too large for the frail body beneath them. Then it crossed the marsh, legs trailing, and vanished into grey trees without needing the world to applaud its leaving. Iris did not work that day. She returned near afternoon, ate lentils, warmed the stove, and sat with her back to the newly oiled floor until dark. No repair failed because she stopped. No ancestor withdrew welcome. No kindness was revoked. The cabin held the day open and did not ask her to fill it. The house had been waiting. By February, light had become the next form of heat. The cabin had 8 windows if the loft opening counted, and Iris counted it because wind did. 3 had no glass at all, only boards nailed across the frames from the inside. 4 were cracked in various directions, their panes held by stubborn putty and luck. The last was the south window above the work table, wavy greenish at the edge, and old enough that Mr. Haskell told her not to replace it unless a bear entered through it, and even then to consider negotiating with the bear. 1800. Maybe earlier, he said, squinting at the pane when he came out one afternoon with a box of supplies. Could be 1788 if someone reused it from the first mine office. See the bubbles. See that sag? Modern glass is too proud of itself. It leaks air. So do most of us. Leave it. She left it. The other 7 demanded work. Haskell sold her salvaged panes from his upper storage room, each wrapped in newspaper, none exactly square. He also sold her DAP 33 glazing putty, glazing points, a putty knife with a flexible blade, and 1 spool of 1/4-inch cotton sash cord. The windows were double hung in theory, though only 2 had moved in recent memory. The counterweights still lived inside the wall pockets, iron cylinders hanging from cords that had rotted and snapped decades earlier. The first day was removal. Iris scored the old paint with a utility knife, tapped the stop moulding loose, and pulled the lower sash inward with such care that impatience would have called it foolish. The wood had swelled, warped, and frozen in its grooves. She labelled each stop with pencil marks because each piece had learned its own imperfect home and would not necessarily fit elsewhere. On the table she laid the sash flat and picked old putty from the rabbit in flakes, using heat from a warmed brick wrapped in cloth to soften stubborn places. Glass broke anyway. Not much. 1 corner cracked off, with a sound like ice underfoot. Iris stood still, put the pieces in a tin, and continued. A broken pane did not accuse, it only became another measurement. DAP 33 came from the can stiff and cold, so she warmed a lump in her hands until it yielded. Mr. Haskell had shown her the motion. Roll the putty into a cord, press it into the rabbit as bedding, set the pane, wiggle gently, push glazing points with the putty knife, then lay the outer bevel in 1 smooth pull. Smooth was the ambition. Her first bevel looked like a ploughed field. She scraped it off and tried again. By the 3rd sash, the angle improved. The putty knife had to ride against the glass and wood at once. Pressure even. Wrist low. Too much pressure and the line thinned. Too little and it bulged. Corners were the hardest. She learned to mitre them with the knife tip, then smooth with 1 thumb dipped in linseed oil. When she stepped back, the new putty formed a pale, angled seam, modest and exact, ready for paint after skinning over. The sash cords were a separate education. She opened the weight pocket beside the frame and found 2 iron weights lying at the bottom among dust, acorn shells, and 1 dead wasp nest. The old cord had frayed into black strings. She fed the new 1/4-inch cotton cord over the pulley, tied it to a fishing sinker, and let it drop through the hidden channel until it reached the pocket. The first time, the sinker lodged halfway and refused to fall. She muttered 1 word she would not have used in Elias's shed, retrieved it, and tried again with a smaller knot. The counterweight knot was a figure 8, Haskell insisted. Not a granny knot, not some desperate lump. A figure 8 held under load and could be untied by a person with patience. Iris tied it once, wrong, cut it, tied again. The second held. She attached the other end to the sash groove, lifted the window, and felt the weight answer from inside the wall. The sash moved 6 inches. It was the first moving window in the cabin. Cold air entered around it, bright and immediate. Iris laughed once under her breath, not with joy exactly, but with the surprise of a thing doing what it had been made to do after so much waiting. She lowered it, raised it, lowered it again, then stopped because pleasure could wear out a repair if indulged too soon. 3 no-glass openings became windows again by the 2nd week of February. The boards came down 1 by 1, and each removal changed the room's sense of itself. The east window admitted morning thin and blue. The west one caught sunset in a brief copper square on the floor. The loft window, once patched with a feed sack and cedar strips, now held a salvaged pane too small for the frame. Bedded in putty and bordered with narrow wood, it would not impress a building inspector. It stopped the wind. The cracked panes she repaired only where replacement was necessary. 1 long diagonal crack in the north window remained, sealed with a thin line of clear shellac and a pasted strip until spring could offer better work. Another pane, cracked like a branch pattern from 1 corner, was replaced with glass that carried a faint ripple, turning the trees outside liquid when seen from the right angle. The original south pane stayed above the work table. Iris cleaned it with vinegar water and newspaper until the grime loosened in brown streaks. Light through it remained imperfect, wavering around the bubbles and waves, bending the work table edge and making the snowshoe forms on the wall seem to breathe when clouds passed. She understood then why Mr. Haskell had defended it. Old glass did not show the world exactly. It showed time looking through. The last window was the small one in the shed, above the long toboggan. Its sash had no lower rail left worth saving, only rot shaped like wood. Iris cut a patch from scrap pine, fitted it with saw and plane, pegged the corners, and reused the 2 panes that had survived beneath grime and spider husks. The putty was nearly finished by then. Scraped from the can edges and warmed in her palms, she worked slowly, standing beside the sled, feeling the cold from the shed floor rise through her boots. Outside that window, a chickadee landed on the walnut branch nearest the wall. It was close enough that she could see each black bead of its eye, the white cheek, the soft grey back, the tiny claws gripping bark. The bird tipped its head and looked into the shed as if inspecting the repair. Iris held still with the putty knife in one hand. The chickadee gave one small sound, not song, only presence, and lifted away toward the clearing. The last bevel of putty went on clean. Iris set the knife down, pressed 2 glazing points into place, and stood back. 8 windows now held the weather at a distance. Not perfectly. Perfection belonged to newer houses with sealed units and bills that came by email. This cabin held with restored weights, salvaged glass, cotton cord, old wood, and putty smoothed by a thumb that had learnt the line. That evening, as the February light withdrew, the windows became dark mirrors, one by one. In each, Iris saw a different portion of the room behind her. The stove, the oiled floor, the shelf of tools, the medal, the work table, the original pane with its wavering world. She did not look long at her own reflection. There was still too much to do, and mirrors could become a kind of weather if a person stood before them without purpose. She banked the fire, covered the putty can, and closed the moving sash until it met the sill with a soft wooden click. Late February found the weak places the way water finds a seam. The roof no longer leaked, the windows held, and the chimney carried smoke upward with a steadiness Iris had learned to trust. But once warmth returned to the room in daily measure, the walls began to confess. Near the chimney breast, 3 patches of plaster swelled, cracked, and opened along lines that had been waiting beneath old paint. One morning, while she was lifting the kettle from the stove, a piece the size of her palm fell onto the hearthstone and broke apart like dry cake. Behind it, horsehair plaster clung to hand-split oak lath. The lath was original, or close enough to original that the distinction did not matter in her hands. Each narrow strip had been riven, not sawn, leaving a surface rough enough to grip the plaster. The nails were small and black. Between the lath, the old keys of plaster had pushed through and hardened generations ago. Little fingers of lime and hair holding the wall to itself. Iris stood with the fallen piece in her hand and saw the animal hair inside it. Dark strands curved through pale lime. A wall was not a flat thing. It was a woven thing. It had been made to hold by mixture, pressure, drying, and faith. Mr. Haskell had a bag of horsehair in his back room from the 1950s, which sounded impossible until he brought it out and set it on the counter. The paper sack had gone soft at the corners and bore the name of a building supplier, long closed. He had saved it from his father's stock because, as he said, throwing away useful material insulted both the dead and the floor space. "For plaster?" he asked. "Yes, sir. 3 coats? Scratch, brown, finish." He looked almost pleased. "Say more." Scratch coat pressed through the lath and scored. Brown coat to build out, about 3/8 inch. Finish coat thin, 1/8, maybe less. Cure, slow. Mist if it dries too fast. Keep from freezing. Ratio, 1 part lime putty, 2.5 parts sharp sand for base. Hair worked through until it binds. Finer sand for finish. He nodded. The wall may yet tolerate you. The first patch taught humility, Iris cut back loose plaster to sound edges, undercutting slightly so the repair would lock, rather than sit on top like an apology. She brushed the lath clean, misted it with warm water, and mixed the scratch coat in a shallow pan. Lime, sand, horsehair teased apart by fingers until no clumps remained. The hair resisted at first, gathering into knots like old grief. She pulled it loose, mixed again, folded, pressed and tested the plaster on the trowel. It had to hold without slumping, but not be so dry it crumbled before reaching the wall. She pushed the scratch coat through the lath with force, feeling it squeeze between strips and form keys behind them. Then she scored the surface with the edge of a broken comb, cross-hatching shallow lines for the next coat to grip. It looked rough, almost primitive, and more honest than any smooth wall she had ever seen. The brown coat came after waiting, not a pretend wait, a full 72 hours, during which she misted the patch morning and evening, kept the stove low, and touched the surface lightly only at the edge. When the scratch coat had set, she laid the brown coat to within 3/8 of the surrounding wall, building slowly, pulling the trowel upward, scraping excess back into the pan. Her first pass sagged near the bottom. She removed it and began again. Lime allowed correction if pride did not harden first. The finish coat was the quietest work. Fine sand, lime, no hair, thin as cream cheese. Haskell had said, then immediately frowned at his own comparison, and told her not to eat it. Iris applied it with the flexible trowel, feathering into the old plaster, following the irregular plane, rather than trying to make the cabin into a newer lie. When the light crossed it that evening, the patch was visible, but not ashamed. Its surface held the faint movement of her hand. 3 patches took 9 days. One near the chimney, Vone below the north window, Vone behind the work table, where old damp had lifted paint into blisters. Each asked for the same sequence and gave back the same modest proof. Cut back. Clean. Missed. Scratch. Score. Wait. Brown. Wait. Finish. Protect. On the last patch, she wrote nothing on the wall, though the impulse came. Instead, she stood in the room after the finish coat had firmed and said, very softly, "These patches will hold another 100 years." The words did not echo. The plaster received them and kept its own counsel. Doris Vale owned the Maple Finch Cafe, and she had the manner of a woman who could carry 6 plates, remember 8 orders, and forgive a debt only if no one made a performance of it. She was broad-shouldered, with silver hair cut at her chin, and a pencil always tucked behind her right ear. Though she rarely used it, the cafe sat between the pharmacy and the barber, its windows steamed by breakfast and soup, its floor worn pale between the counter and the door. Iris entered only when she had to come into town for supplies, and at first she bought nothing, standing near the corkboard to read notices while the smell of coffee and frying onions moved through her coat. Doris noticed without announcing that she noticed. The first paper bag appeared on the cabin porch on March 2, folded at the top and weighted with a stone. Iris found it at dawn after a night of sleet that had glazed every branch in the clearing. Inside were 2 heel ends of bread, a jar of bean soup, 3 apples bruised on one side, and a paper napkin wrapped around 6 tea bags. No note, no name. The next week there was another bag. Rice. A small onion. 2 carrots. Biscuits wrapped in wax paper. Iris carried the bag into town when she next went to Haskell's and stopped at the cafe on the way back. Doris was wiping the counter. "I found food on my porch," Iris said. "That happens in winter. I should pay." "No, I can work." "You are already working." Iris placed 2 coins on the counter. Not from the hidden money, but from $1 earned sweeping Haskell's storage room after hours. Doris looked at the coins, then at Iris. "Payment due when the shop reopens." "I do not know if it will." Doris took the coins, dropped them into the tip jar, and slid a cup of coffee across the counter. "Then in candles when the shop reopens." The sentence was not a question, and the matter closed there. After that, the bags came every 8 or 9 days, never too often, never enough to become charity in the open sense. Doris varied the contents according to what the cafe could spare without waste: a container of stew, day-old rolls, a wedge of cabbage. Once, a slice of pie wrapped so carefully, Iris stood in the doorway of the cabin looking at it for a long moment before setting it on a plate. Doris never asked for thanks. When Iris tried once more, Doris pointed to the chalkboard menu and said, "Read me that price." Iris read it. Doris said, "Wrong. It includes overhead, grief, weather, and fools. You are not the most expensive item in town." Caleb Price first came up the lane on a Schwinn bicycle that had no business in March snow. He was 16, long-boned and red-eared, with hair that escaped his cap in brown curls, and a face still deciding what kind of man it would become. The bicycle was blue under rust, with a crate wired over the back wheel, and one pedal wrapped in duct tape. He pushed it more than he rode it, slipping twice before reaching the clearing. An axe handle stuck out of the crate. A splitting maul lay across the handlebars. Iris was outside stacking brush when he appeared. "You Iris Mercer?" "Yes." He nodded toward the woodpile, which at that point was more aspiration than pile. "I can split." "I cannot pay. I did not ask. I have to say that first. My mother said you would." He leaned the bike against the split walnut and lifted the maul. His coat sleeves were short on his wrists. His gloves had been patched at the palms with pieces of canvas. "About your grandfather," he added. Iris held still. "What about him?" "My mother said he carried my grandmother out from a camp near Duck Hole in 47. Snow up to the windows. Her appendix burst. Doctor said another night and she would have been buried there come thaw. That would have been Elias. My mother said if a Mercer ever needed wood split, I was not to stand around getting tall. He went to work without waiting for permission. Caleb split wood badly at first with too much back and not enough aim. Iris had split little herself and could not teach much, but Mr. Cushing came by on the third day and showed them both how to read checks in the round, how to stand with feet apart, how to let the maul fall through the wood instead of murdering it at the surface. Caleb listened in the solemn way young people sometimes do when correction comes without contempt. By the end of a week the wood pile had order, larger rounds at the back, split stove wood stacked bark up, kindling under the porch roof in a crate. Caleb came after school when the road allowed it, and on Saturdays when his mother could spare him. He accepted water, soup once, and a biscuit only after Iris wrapped it for later, so he could pretend it was not payment. "Take money," she said one afternoon, holding out 2 folded bills. He shook his head. "You worked," my mother said. "That is not an answer. It is at our house." He looked toward the shed, where the repaired window now caught a strip of sun. "She said about your grandfather. She said he would not have counted." Iris folded the bills again and put them away. "Then I will not count either." Reverend Boyd was the third. He did not introduce himself the first morning. He simply walked past the end of the lane where it met the road. A tall man in a black wool coat and boots polished despite the salt. His hat was dark felt with a brim softened by weather. He carried no Bible that Iris could see. He did not come to the cabin, did not call out, did not ask whether she had found a church. He reached the split walnut, paused, tipped his hat toward the clearing, and continued. The next morning he did the same. By the 4th morning, Iris happened to be near the road hauling a sack of lime from Pritchard's place on a borrowed sled. Reverend Boyd stopped then. Not close enough to impose, close enough to speak. "Morning, Miss Mercer." "Morning, Boyd." "Methodist Church." "Yes, sir." He nodded as if that were the whole biography needed. Snow rested on the shoulders of his coat. His face was dark brown, lined finely at the eyes, and calmer than the weather required. He looked toward the cabin, then at the sled rope in her hands. Need help pulling? I can manage. I expect so. He did not say the expected words people often say when they wish to be useful without knowing how. He did not say everything happens for a reason. He did not say she had been blessed, though perhaps his profession might have excused him. He only touched the brim of his hat. Keep her steady. Lord. 4 words. Then he walked on. After that he passed every morning except Sundays when she assumed others required him indoors. Sometimes he tipped his hat from the road. Sometimes, if Iris was outside, he said good morning and nothing more. Once he left a paper packet of stove matches tucked into the crook of the split walnut, wrapped against snow. Another time, after sleet made the lane glassy, she found ashes scattered lightly over the steepest part before dawn, footprints leading away toward town. His prayers, when he offered them, remained 4 words. Guide these hands, Lord. Hold this roof, Lord. Warm this room, Lord. He never waited to see whether she received them. Iris came to understand that his restraint was not distance. It was respect practiced long enough to become habit. The cabin had been crowded by neglect, debt, weather, and silence. He did not add himself to the crowd. He passed by and left room. The cellar had waited because every other place demanded less courage. On February 11th, before the plaster and before Doris's first bag, Iris finally cleared the trapdoor in the shed floor. It lay beneath a workbench near the north wall, half hidden by broken snowshoe frames and a coil of wire so rusted it had become more colour than material. She had seen the iron pull earlier. She had stepped around it. That was postponement, not ignorance. The door lifted hard. Cold air came up first, damp and mineral, carrying the smell of stone, old roots and earth that had never seen sun. Iris propped the door with a length of ash and held the lantern over the opening. 7 granite steps descended into darkness, each one worn in the centre by feet that had carried barrels, potatoes, sled parts, and perhaps children sent down for apples. Frost silvered the edges of the first 3. The lower steps vanished into black. She waited until morning had strengthened. Then she tied a rope around the workbench leg, looped it once around her waist without knotting herself to danger, and went down with the lantern in her left hand. The cellar measured 12 feet by 15, though it felt larger at first because darkness exaggerates what it keeps. The walls were fieldstone, fitted without vanity, and chinked with lime that had held better below ground than above. The floor was not dirt, as she expected, but laid stone, flat pieces arranged in rough courses with sand between them. Moisture darkened the corners, white mineral bloom feathered one wall. A shelf built from chestnut boards sagged under empty crocks, 1 blue jar and a tin lantern frame without glass. In the centre of the floor lay a single dressed granite slab. It did not match the rest. The surrounding stones were irregular, field-gathered, practical. This slab had been cut square, perhaps 3 feet by 2, its surface smoother than the others and set level with an exactness that made the eye return to it. Near one corner, carved shallow into the stone, was the craft mark, the curved shoe crossed by a single line. The mark had collected dust in its groove and looked older for it. Iris knelt beside the slab and set one hand on it. Cold moved through her palm. A person raised on certain kinds of stories might have lifted it, or tried to, or fetched a bar and forced the house to deliver whatever drama lay beneath. Iris did none of those things. The letter had spoken plainly enough. Do not trouble it unless the house has taught you patience first. A roof did not equal patience. A chimney did not. A window, a floor, a repaired wall, even hunger endured without spectacle did not give her permission to take every sealed thing as an invitation. She brushed the carved mark clean with her sleeve and left the slab where it was. The cellar offered more ordinary uses. She carried up 2 crocks, washed them and set one aside for flour, when flour became possible. She found a shelf bracket that could be repaired, an iron hook and a stoneware jug cracked, but handsome enough to hold kindling. She checked the walls for water entry and marked one place where spring melt might seep. She counted the steps going up, because numbers steadied steep places. On the third step from the bottom, her boot struck something that did not sound like stone. She lifted the lantern. Beneath the tread, wedged between the granite riser and the fieldstone wall, was a small oak box no longer than her hand. It had been pushed deep into shadow, hidden not by lock but by placement, the kind of place a child might use for treasure, or an adult for something too tender to label. Iris worked it loose with the brass awl, careful not to splinter the lid. The box had no hinges. The top slid in a groove, swollen tight from damp. She carried it upstairs before opening it, because some discoveries belonged to light. At the work table, she warmed the box near the stove and eased the lid slowly. Inside lay a brass key wrapped in a strip of linen and a tintype photograph darkened at the edges. The key's bow had been shaped not in a simple circle, but like the heritage mark, a curved snowshoe form with a line across its centre. It was small, too delicate for a door, and worn bright at one side where fingers had held it often. The tintype was wrapped in paper. Iris unfolded it and stopped. A young woman stood in front of the cabin in summer. Not this winter-bound version, but the same roofline, the same chimney, the same work-table window open behind her. She wore a long skirt, a white blouse, and an apron dark at the waist from use. In her right hand she held a crooked knife. Beside her, leaning against the wall, were 3 finished snowshoes and the nose of a toboggan catching sunlight. Her face was Iris's face made by another century. Not identical. No face returns exactly. But the line of the cheek, the set of the mouth, the watchfulness around the eyes, the way one shoulder sat slightly higher as if bracing against weather before it arrived, all of it carried forward so plainly that Iris set the photograph down and stepped back from the table. On the back, written in ink nearly faded to smoke, were the words, Margaret Elspeth Mercer, daughter of Ansel Mercer, age 25, summer of 1903, 25, the same age as the woman now standing in the room, wearing 2 sweaters, soot in her nail beds, and a life she had not known how to claim until a condemned deed brought her to it. Iris placed the tintype beside Elena's photograph. Not touching, but near enough that the 2 women could share the mantle's narrow length. Elena's water-clouded face, Margaret's silver-dark gaze, between them, the medal, above them, the shelf of tools, the brass key she set on the mantle as well. She did not know what it opened. A desk, perhaps. A box long gone. A plate hidden in the walnut. Some lock not yet recognized as a lock. The unknown did not trouble her as it once might have. A key could wait. A person could wait with it. That evening she wrote the name Margaret Elspeth Mercer in her ledger beneath Abigail Jane Mercer and James Ansel Mercer. Then she added Elias Matthew Mercer, though he had not been named in the letter, because he belonged to the chain as surely as any carved mark or sealed box. The page became not a family tree exactly, but a line of kept work. Outside, snow moved against the windows. Inside, the brass key lay on the mantel and caught the stove light in its hollow bow. Spring did not come all at once to the Adirondacks. It approached like a cautious neighbour, stopping at the road first, then at the low branches, then at the creek. Snow retreated from the bases of trees before it left the clearing. The lane became treacherous with ice, then mud, then ice again after dark. The roof released its burden in slow avalanches that struck the ground and startled chickadees from the walnut. The creek grew loud with snowmelt, no longer murmuring under ice but speaking in a full brown voice over stone. By mid-March, walnut catkins had begun to lengthen. Though the air still bit before dawn, the marsh opened in black pools. Red-winged blackbirds returned and balanced on cattails with the confidence of small officials. Iris found the first green thing near the south wall, a blade of something thin and brave pushing through old leaves where heat from the cabin had softened the ground. The building had survived its first months with her. That was how she phrased it in the ledger, not the other way around. The cabin had not been saved by a single act, and neither had she. Survival had been a sequence of small obediences, a nail seated properly, mortar kept from freezing, putty smoothed at the right angle, lentils cooked before hunger became foolishness, a day at the marsh when the body refused work, a letter folded along original creases, a key left unexplained. The craft waited. Every object in the workroom pointed toward it. The forms, the rawhide gauge, the bone needles, the soaking trough, the maple sleds, the ash splints sealed in oilcloth. Once, on an April morning warm enough to open the south window, Iris took down the bear paw form and set it on the table. Dust had gathered in the pencil marks. She wiped them clean and laid the brass awl beside it. Her hands wanted to begin. Wanting was not readiness. She had not yet ordered proper ash. She had not soaked rawhide since childhood except in memory. She knew how a lacing pattern should look, but knowledge viewed from a distance could be flattering and false. She would not spend Abigail's inheritance pretending competence for the comfort of a story. Spring would be for practice pieces, not finished work. Small samples, short bends, lacing squares no larger than a plate, failures cheap enough to teach without wasting what had been kept. From the tin box she chose one worn coin, not the oldest, not one of the Morgan dollars, but a silver quarter rubbed nearly smooth at the date. She took it to Haskell and asked him to order rawhide beeswax and a small bundle of ash, suitable for practice. He looked at the coin resting on the counter between them. Breaking into the old money? One coin. For materials? Yes, sir. He picked it up, examined it, and set it back down. Then it is not broken. It is continued. The order would take time. Everything real did. In April, Iris cleaned the shed properly. She hung the toboggan canvas on a line and beat dust from it until the air glittered. She lifted the remaining flat bundle from the sled's hollow core at last, and found not money, but maps, winter routes inked by hand, folded in oilcloth, marked with creek crossings, rescue grades, cabins gone, and dangerous hollows where snow bridged over running water. She did not spread them all at once. One map each evening, one route traced, then returned. Roads are for summer people, Elias had said. Winter keeps its own paths. The maps went into a wooden drawer beneath the work table, above the ledger, below the letter. When the first true warm rain came, it found no open roof, no broken pane, no chimney seam eager to drink. It washed the clearing, darkened the cedar shakes, and released the scent of thawed leaves from under the snow. Iris stood on the porch and watched water run from the eaves in straight lines. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, on December 14th, 2024, Iris finished the first pair. Snow had been falling since morning, the dry kind that speaks softly against glass and gathers cleanly in the hollows of branches. The cabin was warm, not overheated, because overheated rooms made rawhide tighten too quickly and would forget the slow way it had been asked to bend. A kettle breathed on the stove. The work table stood beneath the old south pane, where winter light entered wavered and greenish at the edges, passing through bubbles that had watched more than 1 century fail and begin again. The snowshoes lay side by side on a clean cloth. They were bear paw style, wide and rounded, made for the dense woods and uneven country around the cabin. Black ash frames, split along the ring and bent after steaming. Tow bars shaped with the crooked knife. Rawhide lacing cut wet, pulled to even tension, crossed in a pattern Abigail had described and Elias had once corrected under Iris's childhood hands. The varnish was not glossy. The tallow, beeswax and pine rosin mixture had been warmed and rubbed in until the lacing held a low sheen and a faint resin scent. They were not perfect. One frame carried a slight unevenness near the tail where Iris had bent a fraction too slowly. One crossing in the left shoe sat narrower than its mate. A person who knew the craft would see these things. Iris saw them first, then she saw that both shoes held weight. She had tested them in the clearing, first with sacks of sand, then with her own body, stepping carefully over new snow while Caleb, now taller and quieter, watched from near the woodpile without speaking. The shoes did not shame her. Inside, she wiped them clean, set them on the table, and wrote the date in her ledger. First completed pair. Ash from Haskell order. Rawhide second batch. Left tail uneven but sound. Do not hurry toe bend. She let the ink dry before closing the book. The interior around her had settled into use. Not display, not restoration for strangers' use. The oiled pine floor had darkened where boots crossed from door to stove, and Iris no longer tried to prevent that path from showing. The plaster patches had cured pale and firm, visible in certain light, like healed skin. Shelves held tools, jars, folded maps and coils of rawhide labelled by width. The cot had been replaced by a narrow iron bed bought from a church rummage sale, with wool blankets folded at the foot and a quilt mended by Doris in exchange for 3 beeswax candles poured in tin moulds. The stovepipe was new from stove to chimney, black and sound. A proper kettle hung beside it. 2 lanterns stood on the mantel, 1 oil, 1 battery for storm nights when flame felt unwise. The tintype of Margaret Elena's damaged photograph and the medal remained there as well, kept dusted but not arranged for sentiment. The brass key lay in a small dish made from a cracked saucer, where it had rested through 2 springs, 2 mud seasons, 2 long returns of cold. The shed had become a shop again by inches. The long toboggan, emptied of its hidden burden, now hung from ceiling hooks like a retired boat. Beneath it were 2 benches, one for rough shaving, one for lacing. The soaking trough held water on workdays. Ash strips stood in bundles near the back wall. A rack of forms hung by size, each labelled in Iris's hand, but preserving the older pencil marks beneath. Caleb had built a wood box for shavings, then rebuilt it when the first one collapsed under its own enthusiasm. Mr. Cushing had pronounced the second tolerable. Caleb took that home like a medal. The key found its lock on a morning so cold the sky looked rinsed. It was January 9th, 2 winters after the first repair, and Iris had gone to the split walnut to brush snow away from the lower trunk, checking for animal damage after seeing rabbit tracks near the bark. The horseshoe grown into the tree had always held her attention, but now the winter sun struck it from the side and showed a line beneath the iron she had not noticed before. Not a crack. A seam. She leaned closer. The bark around the horseshoe had thickened and folded, but beneath the lower curve of iron, nearly hidden by living wood, sat a small brass plate, darkened green at the edges. It was no larger than 2 fingers, set into a hollow where the tree had healed around an old wound. At its centre was a keyhole. Iris stood back and let the cold enter her sleeves. She did not run to the cabin. She did not laugh. She placed 1 glove against the trunk, as if asking permission from wood that had been asked to keep more than most trees. Then she went inside, took the brass key from the mantel dish, and returned. The key entered reluctantly. Sap, age and weather had narrowed the place around it. She did not force it. She warmed the key in her palm, breathed gently near the plate, and worked it by fractions until the bit seated. When it turned, the sound was not a click but a soft release, almost lost under the creek's winter murmur. A section of the hollow shifted inward. Inside was a space lined with tin, dry, because the tree and plate together had guarded it better than any box. Iris drew out a folded cloth bundle wrapped in oilskin. The bundle was no larger than a loaf of bread, but she held it with both hands. Snow fell from the walnut branches around her in loose powder. At the work table she opened it. Inside lay a folded 48-star flag, small, perhaps the size used at graves or in a window during wartime. The fabric had yellowed, but the stars remained visible in orderly rows. Beneath it was a note written in another hand, less formal than Abigail's, stronger in the downstrokes. March 3, 1944. If this flag is found, let it be known that James Ansel Mercer carried one like it folded in his breast pocket when he left for the army. This one I keep for his return, or for the day someone here remembers him if I cannot. War makes mothers into clocks. We count departures, mail days, rumours and footsteps that do not come. If he comes home, this flag will hang in the window. If he does not, let it be folded again and kept in the house. A country is a large thing, but a son leaves from a kitchen. Margaret Elspeth Mercer. Iris read the note once, then placed it beside the medal. James had come home. Abigail's letter had said so. He had come home with a limp bronze and silence. The flag had remained hidden anyway, perhaps because the return had not resembled the return his mother had imagined when she wrote the note. Perhaps because some hopes, once folded, cannot easily be opened even after the door does. Iris unfolded the flag only far enough to see the stars, then folded it again along its lines. She wrapped the note with it and placed both in a cedar box Caleb made later that month, with no varnish, only oil. The brass key returned to the mantel, but not to the dish. She hung it on a nail beneath the tintype, where it could be seen and not used casually. The medal found its public place on May 27th, Memorial Day, 2024. Before the first completed snowshoes, but after Iris had learned enough of the family line to understand where to go. She took the bus part way, then rode with Reverend Boyd the rest, to Gerald B. H. Solomon Saratoga National Cemetery in Schoolerville, where rows of white stones held names in patient order under a wide sky. James Ansel Mercer was not buried there. His grave was older, in a smaller cemetery nearer Minerva, but Reverend Boyd had told her the National Cemetery held a Memorial Day service where names from local families could be spoken aloud if someone brought them. Iris carried the medal in a blue cloth pouch and the folded information copied from Abigail's letter. When the time came, she gave the name to a volunteer wearing white gloves. The volunteer pronounced it carefully: James Ansel Mercer, United States Army, 1944. The sound went out over grass, flags, folding chairs, and the low murmur of people who had come carrying their own names. Iris did not cry. She stood with her hands folded around the empty pouch until the service ended. Afterward, she and Reverend Boyd drove to the Minerva Cemetery, where James's actual stone leaned slightly near a maple. She brushed lichen from the carved letters with water and a soft brush, then set a small cedar shaving from the shop at the base of the marker, because flowers felt too temporary for a man whose people had worked in wood. "Keep him known," Lord Reverend Boyd said. 4 words again. Iris placed the medal back on the mantel that evening, but something about it had changed. Not the bronze, not the ribbon, the room's relation to it. A name spoken in daylight does not stop being private. It only stops being lost. The money remained mostly where Abigail had placed it. That surprised people when they eventually learned in partial ways that some stored inheritance had been found. They expected transformation to look like spending. Iris had used 3 coins and 2 small bills by then, 1 silver quarter for rawhide and ash, 1 worn dime toward glass, 1 Franklin half for beeswax, and 2 old $10 notes converted carefully at a bank in Glens Falls after Mrs. Washburn advised her how to do so without inviting foolish curiosity. Those bills bought a proper chimney cap and a well test. The rest she sealed again. Not in the toboggan, because the sled had done its work and deserved retirement. She placed the bills and coins in a fireproof box bought new after long consideration, then set that box inside a larger cedar chest built by Caleb under Mr. Cushing's correction. The cedar chest went beneath the work table, behind a hinged panel that looked like ordinary wall. Inside the lid, Iris wrote, in pencil, first and later in ink, "For the next one, spend slowly." She kept a separate ledger of every use: date, amount, purpose, reason, balance. When she bought food during the hardest months, she wrote food without shame. A person could not restore a craft while starving beside it. When she paid Haskell's account in installments, she wrote each payment with satisfaction, so plain it almost warmed the page. Mr. Haskell accepted the first payment without comment. On the final one, he stamped the ledger paid in red ink and turned the book around for her to see. "There," he said. "The store survives your character. I said I would pay. I believed you. That is why the stamp is not surprised." May Haskell came from the back with a paper bag and set it beside Iris's elbow. "No," Iris said. May looked at her. Iris corrected herself. Only if I may buy it. It is yesterday's bread. Then sell me yesterday. May's mouth moved into the smallest possible smile. Half price. The shop reopened without announcement. There was no sign at first. No ribbon. No article. No photograph of Iris holding tools in a clean apron for strangers to admire. Doris put an index card on the cafe corkboard between a notice for firewood and a flyer for fiddle lessons. Snowshoe repair, rawhide lacing, small sled work, Mercer winter works, leave name with Doris. The card was written in Doris's square hand because Iris had tried writing 3 versions and disliked each one for seeming to ask too much. Doris read them, took the pencil, and made the matter plain. The first customer was a man from Newcombe with a pair of beaver-tail snowshoes his father had used for trapping. The frames were sound. The lacing had failed. He laid them on the work table and ran one finger along the broken web. "No hurry," he said. "There is always a hurry hidden somewhere," Iris answered, then surprised herself by sounding like Elias. She repaired them over 12 days, soaking old knots, cutting new rawhide, matching the pattern to the surviving section. When the man returned, he lifted the shoes and held them by the frames, testing weight. My father would have liked this. Iris wrote the payment in the ledger after he left. Repair, beaver tail pair. First paid work. By the second winter, Doris's corkboard card had a waiting list beside it, names written on cafe order slips, church bulletins, envelopes, and once on the back of a child's spelling test. 43 names, not all orders, some only people who wanted to be told when Iris would make new snowshoes. Hunters, hikers, a museum volunteer, a woman whose grandfather's sled needed a new crosspiece, a camp caretaker who wanted 2 rescue shoes wide enough for deep snow, one schoolteacher who asked whether Iris might speak to students and accepted the answer, not yet, without offence. 43 was not fame. 43 was work enough to respect and small enough to do honestly. The mailing list lived in a recipe box from Doris, alphabetized with index cards. Iris wrote each name by hand. She did not own a computer. Haskell offered an old one from his nephew, and she declined for the present. Paper did not require passwords, updates, or moods. Paper waited. Caleb returned with the sign in April. He was 18 by then, taller than his father had been, with his bicycle replaced by a dented pickup that started only after he spoke to it unkindly. He had finished high school early, taken work with a carpenter in North Creek, and still came by when the woodpile needed help, or when he wanted to use the shave horse Iris had rebuilt in the shed. He had grown quieter, not withdrawn, only more deliberate. His hands had begun to look like the kind that could make a living without needing to explain themselves first. The sign lay across the truck bed under a blanket. "I made something," he said. "That sounds dangerous." "Mr." Cushing insulted it twice. "So it is probably close." Together they carried it to the porch. It was carved from a single plank of pine, painted cream, with letters cut deeply and filled in dark green. Not perfect letters. Better than perfect. Human letters, each with the slight variation of a hand that had stayed with the work. Mercer Winter Works, Daughters. Iris read it once. Then again. The old sign did not say that. No, there were not always daughters. Caleb looked at the plank. Not at her. There were... The sign was wrong. The words entered quietly, the way true things often do when they have been waiting in a room too long. He had carved a small craft mark between the lines, the curved shoe crossed by one bar. Around the border he had cut tiny notches like lacing, uneven in a few places where the tool had slipped. Iris touched one of those notches with her thumb. "I cannot pay for this properly." "You already did." "No, I did not." My mother says I stand different since working here. That is not wages. No. It is more expensive. He grinned then, briefly, almost embarrassed by his own sentence, and looked toward the roof. Where do you want it? They hung it above the shed doors where the old painted board had weathered nearly blank. Mr. Cushing supervised from the ground, declaring the left side too high, then the right, then the left again until Caleb threatened to hang him beside it for balance. Reverend Boyd passed at the road and tipped his hat. Doris arrived later with sandwiches wrapped in paper, pretending she had been on her way somewhere else entirely. Mr. Haskell brought screws he claimed were surplus and charged Iris 1 cent so the books would not complain. When the sign was fixed, everyone stood back. The words looked as if they had always been missing and had now returned. That night, after they had all gone, Iris lit the oil lamp and took out a sheet of good paper from the drawer beneath the maps. She had bought the paper in Glens Falls with modern money earned from repairs. It was cream-coloured, plain, and thick enough to receive ink without feathering. She set Abigail's letter to the left, not to copy, but to keep company with the act. Then she began writing her own. My dear one, whoever you are. She stopped after the first line. The stove breathed snow, late for the season, tapped softly at the window, though the calendar insisted on April. The new sign outside creaked once in the wind. Iris held the pen above the paper and understood why Abigail's letter had carried both instruction and restraint. To write for an unknown inheritor was to admit that one's own hands would not always be present to explain the proper angle of a blade, the danger of wet, rawhide drying too near heat, the reason money should be spent slowly, the place where grief can sit without being allowed to rule the room. She wrote for an hour. Not the full letter. That would take years. Perhaps a true letter had to be earned by seasons. She wrote the opening, her name, the date, and the first things she knew without borrowing from Abigail. Do not mistake being alone for being unclaimed. Repair the roof before you admire the view. If someone leaves food on your porch, wash the jar and return it. Pay Haskell first, or whoever has become Haskell by the time you read this. A house is not saved by affection. It is saved by maintenance. She smiled at that last line, not because it was clever, but because it was plain enough to last. The sheet went into a folder labelled Next Letter. The folder went into the drawer with the maps, above the winter routes and below the ledger. She would add to it when the craft taught her something worth leaving. Not every thought deserved paper. The ones that did could wait for exact words. By the closing winter of this telling, the cabin was no longer condemned. The county file had been amended after an inspection. Mrs. Washburn arranged with a man who respected old buildings enough to be severe with them. He listed remaining deficiencies in a formal report. No full-time electrical service, limited water system, seasonal access concerns, ongoing maintenance required. Then he wrote that the structure was stable, roof sound, chimney serviceable, windows repaired, floor safe under normal load. It was the least sentimental document Iris had ever treasured. Mrs. Washburn mailed a copy in a large envelope. Inside, on a yellow sticky note, she had written, "Filed." Nothing else. Iris pinned the report inside the cupboard door. It belonged with useful things. The shop never became large, it did not need to. Winters brought repairs, summers brought preparation. Autumn brought orders from people who understood that handmade work cannot be demanded like a package from a warehouse. Iris made some snowshoes, repaired more, restored sleds, replaced lashings, and copied certain safe portions of the winter maps for a local search and rescue volunteer after walking the routes herself and marking what had changed. She did not sell the maps. Some knowledge loses its soul when priced by the sheet. The hidden granite slab in the cellar remained untouched. Sometimes carrying potatoes or jars down the 7 steps, Iris would pause beside it and brush dust from the carved mark. She was older by then only in the way labour ages a person into her own body, stronger in the wrists, slower to panic. less willing to explain herself to those who confused quiet with emptiness. The slab waited under the house, and she let it. Not every door in a life needs opening as soon as the key is found. The brass key, after opening the walnut, had taught her that one evening in late December, with the first completed pair of snowshoes hanging above the workbench and Caleb's sign dark against fresh snow outside, Iris stepped onto the porch. The air was clean enough to sting. Smoke rose from the chimney in a straight line. The split walnut stood at the edge of the clearing, holding its healed wound, its horseshoe, its emptied chamber. Beyond it, the lane curved toward the road, now marked by her own snowshoe tracks crossing and recrossing winter. She wore a proper coat, bought used and mended at the cuffs. Her boots did not leak. In her pocket was the rawhide scrap she had carried from Elias's shed years before, still wrapped in wax paper, though the wax had cracked and been replaced. She had never used it. Some materials are not meant to be consumed. Some are meant to remind the hand what it has survived. Inside, the stove waited for another stick. The letter waited in its tin. The money waited in cedar. The next letter waited in a folder with only a beginning. The house held them all without hurry. The house had been waiting. A snowshoe-maker's cabin waits. It has always waited. It waits in the patience of bent ash cooling on a form, in the rawhide drawn tight enough to carry weight, in the toboggan plank hollowed by hands that trusted someone unknown to listen for the duller note. It waits in rooms others call empty because they do not know how much presence work can leave behind. It waits through tax sales, winter closures, county warnings, and the long forgetfulness of roads that became easier to plough than to understand. And sometimes, when the world has narrowed a person to one backpack, folded notice, and the last coins in her palm, it waits without announcing itself at all. Back in Elizabethtown, in the county clerk's office, Mrs. Washburn kept a desk drawer as orderly as any ledger. Pens to the left, rubber bands in a paper box, paper clips sorted by size in a shallow dish, and beneath the tray, folded into quarters, lay the dollar bill she had placed there on the morning of the deed. She never spent it. Not because a dollar was sacred, and not because the county books would have noticed its absence. She kept it because offices, like houses, sometimes need one quiet proof that the law can make room for mercy without losing its shape. Years later, when a new clerk asked why an old bill sat in the drawer under a note that read Mercer copy fee, Mrs. Washburn only closed the drawer gently and said, "That one belongs where it is." Outside her window, snow moved along the courthouse steps, patient and fine. Covering every footprint until morning asked them to be made again.